3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3. 3, 2, 1. We are live. I'd like to call this meeting of the Thursday, September 28th Delta Stewardship Council meeting to order and begin with the roll call.
Tatian here.
Fiorini here. We have a quorum. The next action will be to recess into closed executive session. For those of you that are following on the web broadcast, I estimate that we will be reconvening around 10 o'clock. So tune in 9:45 to 10 o'clock and we should be ready to resume. So we are now in recess to closed executive session.
We're going to have to decide how much detail we want to put in. There's a lot of detail. Give me the I just want to give you the whole thing, but I want to highlight it.
Okay, we are reconvening in open session. I have nothing to report from closed session. That completes file item number 4. Let the record show that Councilmember Gatto has joined us since roll call this morning. File item number 5, adoption of the August 24th, 2017 meeting summary.
So moved.
Tatian moves, Weinberg seconds. Any discussion on the motion? Then let's proceed with the vote, beginning with Councilmember Damrell.
Damrell, aye. Weinberg, aye. Gatto, aye.
Tatian, aye.
Fiorini, aye. Motion passes unanimously. File item number 6, Chair's report. Just one housekeeping item. You have an envelope at your station that is your opportunity to contribute to the Water and Coffee Fund. To keep us well hydrated here at the front table. The recommended contribution is $20, and you'll see a detailed accounting of how previous investments have been spent.
You told me 30.
Thank you very much. So with that, unless anyone has meeting attendance or presentations that they would like to share with us in the previous month. Yes.
I actually did 2 presentations in the previous month, so these were the first time I've gone out and spoke specifically about the Delta Council. One was to the San Diego Taxpayers Association, one of their subcommittees, so I talked about the Delta Plan and what we've been doing and the amendments that we've been working on. And then I spoke at the Leavenhaven Municipal Water District, very similar presentation, just talking about why it's important to to implement the Delta Plan and achieve the co-equal goals. So both of those, and why it's important to Southern California. And I think both of those presentations, I had an interested audience and appreciated the opportunity to kind of show our flag down there in San Diego County.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm just reviewing the timeline based on when we'll be breaking for lunch and who's going to be making presentations, so excuse me for that. Ken, thank you for that report.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to thank staff for helping me put together that presentation, so appreciate that to Keith and Jessica. Thank you.
Okay, great. That completes file item number 6. On to file item number 7, the Executive Officer's Report. Jessica Pearson.
Good morning. It's been a tumultuous year so far weather-wise, with great impacts to natural resources. I've been collecting some of the stats that I've come across in recent weeks that have caught my attention, and I compiled just a few. The U.S. has experienced one of its worst fire seasons ever. According to the Fish and Wildlife Service, 8.1 million acres were burned by wildfire so far this year, and the 10-year average is 5.2 million. The U.S. has never been hit by 3 hurricanes this strong in the same season in modern records. Hurricane Irma was the strongest Atlantic Basin hurricane ever recorded outside of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. 3 days at Category 5 made it the longest Category 5 hurricane anywhere on Earth since satellite storm tracking began. Irma had the strongest maintained winds on record at 37 hours with 185 miles per hour and above, prompting the largest evacuation in history of the Bahamas and probably of the U.S. We saw even lesser storms in Maria and Harvey cause incredible damage with their more direct hits, including the unleashing of Harvey of 19 trillion gallons of rain, triggering unprecedented flooding. New all-time warmest records were set this year, including coastal or near coastal California cities matching or exceeding their all-time temperature records for any month, including, and this shows you the range, Eureka, San Luis Obispo, and even the Farallon Islands. Downtown San Francisco's all-time temperature record was shattered previously at 103 at 106. And overall, summer 2017 was officially California's hottest year on record, with the previous record set in 2016. So these are the types of events that are reshaping the way that we have to think about future climate and its effects on natural resource management. The front and center for our work, the co-equal goals. Next month, we'll launch our ecosystem amendment, and we'll need to, in those discussions, face the reality of some of these future challenges head-on as we revisit our vision and strategies for a healthy Delta ecosystem in Chapter 4 of the Delta Plan. Last week, Dr. Calloway and I, along with select senior staff, attended the second meeting of the National Academies of Sciences Committee on Grand Challenges and Opportunities in Environmental Engineering and Science for the 21st Century. Their first meeting was held in Washington, D.C. in the spring, and council representatives, including our chair, attended by phone. The council is a co-sponsor of the committee's work and is particularly interested in how the future research agenda for the federal government can benefit the Delta and California's water management as a whole. This particular committee meeting was a mix of open and closed working sessions over 2 days. The open session on Tuesday, September 6th, featured several distinguished scientists who spoke on the topics of grand challenges facing food, water, and energy, respectively. The following day, there was a more focused open session on how environmental engineering and research and practice can evolve to address sea level rise challenges in the Bay Area and beyond. So the committee is going to meet later this fall to complete a draft of their report, which will include a high-level list of goals. And the National Academy's Grand Challenges reports in the past have been widely circulated, and they're really used as standards for funding educational curriculum and communication. Last month, we heard from the Department of Fish and Wildlife regarding their forthcoming Delta Conservation Framework document. Yesterday, they sent word that they have now released the public draft, and they would appreciate comments by November 10th. The draft is available on their website. They've scheduled public workshops in the Delta at the Gene Harvey Community Center in Walnut Grove on October 19th from 6 to 8 p.m. and October 30th from 1 to 4 p.m. And I believe we have flyers with these dates and locations on our table outside. In addition to these workshops, they have made it clear that they're available to meet with any member of the Delta community directly upon request if someone is unable to attend a workshop. And I'm pleased to let you know that the Floodplain Management Association earlier this month presented the council with an award of excellence for our work on the Delta Levees investment strategy. According to the association, this award seeks to find and recognize outstanding floodplain management projects, programs, and activities. Entries can be local, regional, or national government agencies, special districts, or even private consulting firms. Entries include either an overall program or a specific project or activity that epitomizes the best in floodplain management. The association is a national organization that promotes the development of principles and tools for effective floodplain management programs, and it's known as the premier venue for floodplain management professionals who are interested in reducing risk and creating sustainable floodplains. The council's supervising engineer, Dustin Jones, who was our project manager, accepted the award for the council at the association's annual conference in Long Beach earlier this month. In developing the levee investment strategy, we coordinated with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board and the Department of Water Resources, and we'll have the opportunity later today on the agenda to discuss their recently adopted Central Valley Flood Protection Plan update under Agenda Item 9. As usual, I've included, go ahead.
On behalf of the council, we want to commend you and your staff and ask that you would pass along our congratulations for this well-deserved award.
Yeah, and Dustin has a shiny award hanging on his office wall, so that's great. As usual, I've included copies of the month's outgoing coordination letters from our staff to those with projects, programs, or plans that affect implementation of the Delta Plan, and particularly those that will need to file consistency with our Delta Plan. Our staff are in conversation with many of these entities, notably here the YOLO Conservancy, to engage them in early consultation and walk them through the consistency filing process. I think with that, I will turn it over to, I have one personnel announcement. Corey Copeland recently started as an environmental scientist in our performance management unit. Born and raised in Oklahoma, he has a bachelor's of science degree in geography from McAllister College in Minnesota, and he's pursuing his PhD at UC Davis in human ecology. His dissertation research has focused on trying to measure the relationship between water supply and demand and the true cost of water in California. At the council here, he'll be focusing on tracking the water supply performance measures, as well as some of the Delta's place and reduced risk performance measures. So we want to welcome Corey. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Stambrough for the legislative report.
Thank you, Jessica. Good morning, council. September marked the home stretch for the first year of the legislative session, with both houses adjourning for the interim earlier this month. As a result, there were a few bill developments that I'll highlight this morning. However, before turning to the bills, I wanted to start with a follow-up to a council request on the organization's legislative policy. As you will recall, last month's meeting included a discussion on how to better clarify certain aspects of the policy. In response, staff has proposed revisions for council consideration that would do the following. Describe how a bill, under ordinary time constraints and circumstances, could be placed on a meeting agenda for council consideration. Add a process for how the council would consider sponsoring legislation. Detail the steps that council staff would take in response to the council electing to sponsor or take a position on a measure. And finally, the title of the policy is proposed to be revised to more accurately reflect the scope of the revised policy. With that, Mr. Chair, as I did last month, I will pause my report here for council discussion and be happy to answer any questions that the council may have.
Great, thanks, Ryan. I'll call your attention to agenda item 7B1, attachment 1. There's a redlined addition with the suggested revisions. I understand, since this was distributed, Ryan, that Councilmember Johnston had a recommended amendment. to this. He's unable to be here at this moment. He'll be here later. But I wanted to inquire of you what that is, and can you share it with us?
Certainly. So, Councilmember Johnson expressed the thought that the proposed policy and the revisions to the proposed policy, he was concerned that it could potentially constrain the council to act in a timely or expeditious manner, given, as you know, the calendar of the legislative cycle at times does not always lend itself to waiting for the next council hearing. So with that, I have put together, Mr. Chair, some proposed revisions that I would like to disseminate to the council for your consideration.
And that revision is to point 2?
That revision is to number 2.
Okay.
I'm looking at our council. Should I read that into the record now, or?
Well, yes, I'd recommend reading it into the record, but if there's handouts to pass to the council, then Pat might want to make copies for the public as well.
So, Mr. Chair, to briefly summarize what's being proposed here for council consideration is taking number 2 and splitting it into an A and a B. On the fourth line down in the sentence that begins with, if a council member, I'll just read the sentence in its entirety for the public. If a council member would like to place a measure on the agenda for an upcoming meeting, whether for discussion or for the council to consider taking a position, the member, and the addition proposed here is where possible, that's highlighted, should inform the chair and the executive officer at least 3 weeks prior to the next council meeting. That would be 2A as revised, as proposed to be revised, and then B, this is a new addition which reads, this provision is not intended to preclude any council member from making a motion to the chair on proposed legislation. And those are the 2 proposed revisions to offer some additional clarity from a timing perspective.
Okay. So we have suggested revisions that we've received from staff, and we have a council member suggested change. Can we receive the Patrick Johnston's recommendation by common consent?
Yes.
Okay. So we now have the updated suggested revisions that are now, that include a 2A and 2B.
And Chair Fiorini, if I can interrupt, I just heard word from Pat Rogers that the copies are available for the public on the front table.
Okay, great, thank you. Outside, right outside the front door.
Could I offer another amendment? But this is not to paragraph 2, it's to 3, and it's a very small one. It currently reads, the council member shall consult with the chair and appropriate council staff. I would add to that, and the executive officer and appropriate staff. I think that Jessica has to be in the loop here directly, and I think that's necessary. And I talked to Jessica about it, and she is in agreement.
Okay, so it would read, consult with the chair,
And the executive officer.
the executive officer, insert the executive officer, and then proceed with an appropriate
Correct.
council staff.
Correct.
Can we receive that by common consent?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So far, so good.
All right. Bethany, do we take so we're adopted then?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Not
Okay.
yet. We're not doing that good.
Oh, we're not doing that. So would you like me to?
So, I'm just going to
Okay.
insert the chair and executive officer. So I've got the language in front of me. Does anybody need to hear the revisions in their entirety, or are you fine with what we've, okay. So we're ready for a motion.
And public comment.
We're ready for public comment. Do we have any blue slips for public comment? Okay. Having no requests, we're ready for a motion.
Move.
Mr. Chair, if I may make a comment or two?
Well, let's get a second.
Okay.
Is that a second?
That's a second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Comments?
I just wanted to thank staff for bringing this forward. I think it's, well, I'll speak for myself, I think the council as well, looking for something where it's a balance between the executive officer and the chair and the rest of us who feel strongly about a particular bill or a subject matter. So I think this achieves that balance, and I appreciate the work that was put into it. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other comments? Ready for the question?
This is the question?
This is the question.
All right. Damrell, aye.
Weinberg, aye.
Tatali, aye.
Fiorini, aye. Motion passes unanimously. Ryan, thank you.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Chair, now moving on to the second portion of my report this morning, which pertains to an update on a number of bills. Starting with the two bills in your packet, both of which are currently awaiting action by the governor. AB 313 by Assemblymember Adam Gray from Merced, which would create a water rights division within the Office of Administrative Law to serve as an independent party to opine on cases where water rights violations are alleged by the state board. The bill stems from a belief by some that appealing a water rights enforcement action issued by state board staff is of little use, since the appeal would be heard by the board members themselves, who may be reluctant to overrule staff. One additional point to note here is that if signed, the newly created OAL division would only be offering a recommendation on the appeal, with final say still vesting with the state board. And then the second bill included in your packet this month is AB 339 by Devin Mathis from Visalia, which would allow funds from the state board's cleanup and abatement account to permanently fund urgent drinking water needs of local communities. Sponsored by the state board, this relatively straightforward bill would reinforce the list of funding mechanisms available to address contaminated drinking water, an issue obviously that continues to present a significant challenge in some parts of the state. Both AB 313 and 339 are currently awaiting governor's action, which he currently has until October the 15th to make. Moving on to a few additional bills that are not in this month's packet, but certainly worth highlighting, I believe. The first is AB 1133 by Mr. Dolly from Lassen County, which was signed earlier this week and amends the California Endangered Species Act to allow the Director of Fish and Wildlife to authorize the take of an experimental population of endangered, threatened, or candidate species under certain conditions. As the Council is aware, experimental populations are a tool that have been used to reintroduce species to their native habitat in recent years, and typically are subject to relaxed management restrictions relative to their native counterparts. AB 1133 follows the recent precedent set by the use of an experimental population of spring run Chinook salmon in the San Joaquin River, which resulted in that species being present in the San Joaquin for the first time in over 60 years. This new authority obviously holds interesting potential and certainly could complement a number of current restoration endeavors, including efforts related to the salmon resiliency strategy, which calls for targeted reintroduction in specific areas. Another bill of note is SB 5. This is the Parks and Water Bond, which, if signed by the governor, would be placed on the ballot next year. While the $4 billion bond proposal is a hybrid between water, parks, and climate-related endeavors, there are a few particulars that I will briefly highlight. In addition to including $12 million for the Delta Conservancy to carry out its core mission activities, the proposal includes $50 million for Delta levies and $200 million for voluntary settlement agreements. On the latter element, the voluntary settlement appropriation would only apply to those agreements submitted to Fish and Wildlife by the end of the current fiscal year. Any remaining funds would be redirected to more general watershed and ecosystem restoration efforts outlined in Proposition 1 from 2014, or for compliance with previous water settlements or compacts. And then turning briefly to the bills that failed to advance to the governor by the end of this session and are, as a result, are now two-year bills. This includes AB 732, a bill that the council is very familiar with, which would have extended the cost share for the Delta Levees subventions program. Also failing to advance were the water conservation proposals put forward by Senator Hertzberg and Assemblymember Friedman, which were the subject of a significant amount of work by interested parties on all sides over the summer. As a result, these bills will be back for consideration when the legislature adjourns in January. And then finally, with the indulgence of the council, I'd like to report on a development outside the typical parameters of the organization and my legislative report. And that is, as a result of the governor signing Mr. Bloom's AB 1540 last week, California now has an official dinosaur, which is the Augustinolophus morrissey, the one dinosaur whose bones have been only found in California and nowhere else. And with that, Mr. Chair, that concludes my report. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. Ken, the reporting structure, does that line up with your request to highlight matters of key interest?
Yeah,
Thank you.
just I think it helps us to know what we really should focus on.
Okay, all right. Any other
Thank you.
comments or questions? Hearing none. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Okay, we do not have a legal report today, so I'm just going to preview the other agenda items. We'll have a presentation on the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan update, and then we'll have a presentation on the Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan for the San Francisco Estuary. And with that, I conclude my executive officer's report.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. We got a game time decision to make. Aaron, how long do you anticipate the flood? About an hour. John, your report? All right, then I think we can proceed as scheduled, and then we will break for lunch after the panel presentations and discussion. So, on to file item number 8, the lead scientist report.
Great. So this morning I have a number of items that are in your binder. Before I get into those, I just want to mention one additional issue. We just recently had the Independent Science Board monthly meeting here. We had a very productive meeting. They submitted their final report on the CSO amendment, which I think you all have received. So that and their input on the report was generally positive. They identified some areas where there's some concerns that they have, but overall, I think it was a relatively positive report. In addition to that, we had a field trip to Sassoon Bay that was very productive. That there's 10 members on the Independent Science Board. There were over 30 people on the field trip. The field trip was to visit managed marshes, primarily within Sassoon Bay. We also saw the salinity control gates that are there. And it was just a great opportunity for the Science Board to see areas on the field, to interact with our staff. So a number of our staff came, and then also a number of the public were there. You all are invited on those field trips, so I encourage you. There's probably 3 or 4 field trips each year that the Independent Science Board puts together, and as those are lined up in the future, we'll try to identify those and let you know in advance so that you could participate. Because one, it's just a great way to see some areas and learn about current issues. It's also an opportunity to interact with the Science Board that I think might be useful. At that meeting, I was asked to present my vision to the Independent Science Board. I'll just briefly highlight the things that I really feel, some critical issues that I presented to them that I'd like to see as priorities for the science program moving forward. One is to reinvigorate the competitive grants program that we have, to have open solicitation for research within the Delta, to put a strong emphasis on climate change throughout the efforts that we're working on, to really focus on the opportunities and challenges associated with habitat restoration within the Delta, to take advantage of the significant effort that's already been put forward to address the opportunities for integrated modeling and to make significant advancement in terms of identifying how models could be used to address management questions within the Delta, and also to try to work hard to strengthen connections between the Delta and the Bay, both in terms of science and policy issues. So those are some areas that I'd really like to push forward over my term here as lead scientist. And if you have questions about any of those, I'd be happy to talk about them in more detail. So with that, I'll move into the issues that are included in the lead scientist report in your packet. There's a couple of papers that are included there that I'll just briefly summarize. The first one, as often we do, we include a paper from the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science, a local paper, and that paper is quantifying trade-offs among ecosystem services, biodiversity, and agricultural returns in an agriculturally dominated landscape under future land management scenarios. This paper I included because I think it's a thoughtful way to try to address some of the challenges of evaluating land management and the benefits and trade-offs for different approaches. So they looked at they looked at 3 different scenarios. A scenario of significant habitat restoration focused along the Cosumnes. This was done in an area adjacent to the Cosumnes River. And so the restoration really focused on riparian restoration around the river. They looked at a scenario into the future where urbanization grows, and then they looked at what they call enhanced agriculture, where they specifically do agriculture that could have some benefits for wildlife. They're not saying that those are likely scenarios or likely predictions of what will happen into the future. They're just setting them up as scenarios to evaluate what those potential management decisions could have, what impacts those might have. They looked at how those would affect carbon storage, biodiversity, fertilization impacts or nitrogen impacts, and agricultural production. And as you might expect, they found some significant trade-offs. Urbanization reduced impacts associated with fertilizer use, but reduces biodiversity and carbon storage. Enhanced agriculture, two of the interesting things were that habitat restoration, if focused around the river, has significant benefits in terms of carbon storage and biodiversity without really significant losses, small losses in agriculture, but not dramatic losses in agriculture. And then the enhanced agriculture effort significantly increases agricultural income. At the same time, it improves opportunities for certain wildlife species, and they focused on the Swainson's hawk, that definitely there's some significant benefits there. And also promotes carbon storage if the right sorts of crops are used. So I think it's just a thoughtful way to look at these potential trade-offs. There's lots of assumptions that go into the evaluations that they made, but it really clearly sets up this framework so that you can evaluate potential benefits and impacts. The second paper is not Delta specific, and given my interest, I chose a wetland paper to start off my term here with. And the wetland paper looks at the Gulf Coast. It's entitled Macroclimatic Change that's expected to transform coastal wetland ecosystems this century. Really, the take-home message of this paper is sea level rise is critical, but we also need to think about other aspects of climate change. And so what they did was, rather than look at the potential effects of sea level rise on coastal wetlands, they looked at how temperature and precipitation shifts could affect plant communities in coastal wetlands. And they did this looking at 10 estuaries across the Gulf Coast from Texas all the way to Florida, where they have really significant field data on the distribution of plants and the distribution of what they looked at really was mangrove communities and a couple of different kinds of salt marsh communities, and then open areas that are common in some of their more arid estuarine marshes. And what they found was they looked at scenarios of climate change from now until 2050 with increasing temperature and shifts in precipitation. What they found was that with warming temperatures, we're going to have a significant increase in mangroves. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a shift in habitat communities on the Gulf Coast. So we'll see mangroves that are more tropical species are going to likely expand into areas that are typically dominated by more salt marshes, similar to what we have here in the Delta and in the San Francisco Bay. They also found that in arid areas, marshes will be lost because of increased temperatures and increasing salinity that will lead to conversion of marshes to unvegetated areas. So again, I think the real point here is they're just trying to remind us sea level rise is really critical and certainly something not to include. So they're not saying sea level rise is important, they're just saying also think about these effects of temperature and precipitation or salinity that will have big effects on our coastal communities. So those were the two papers I wanted to highlight. In addition to those two papers, we had a series of brown bag seminars here over the last 2 months looking at the California Environmental Flow Framework, an effort to really try to understand what's critical to understand about the hydrology of our streams, and how do we try to quantify what the flow dynamics or flow characteristics of streams are and relate that to the ecology or biology of streams so that we can understand in a better way how to manage the stream flows to promote healthy riparian ecosystems. And so Sarah Yarnell started out that series. She's from UC Davis. She presented this California Environmental Flow Framework has sort of a series of tiers or levels. She presented the first level, which is really just a broad approach to try to understand what the appropriate characteristics are for flows for streams across California. And this is a multi-year effort and a multi-investigator effort that the other people who presented as part of the brown bag also are a part of, and that will be concluding in the next, I think, 6 months or so. So this is really just their interim findings. What they did to try to set these criteria is first to classify streams. So what they acknowledged was you can't do this there's no single approach for streams across the state, but they classified streams. They came up with 9 different categories. Interestingly, she pointed out that her work and Eric Stein, I'll talk about in just a second, they started classifying streams in different ways. She focused more on physical aspects and hydrology. Eric, who's a biologist, focused on classifying streams around biologies. They came up with almost exactly the same approach. 80% of their classifications were exactly the same. They united them. They came up with 9 different types of streams based on whether they're snow-fed or rain-fed or groundwater-fed, and then the topography, geology, and soils in the area. And then for each of those 9, what Sarah has been doing and her colleagues is to look at the characteristic flows that we find on those types of streams and evaluate what's most critical about them. Is it the early spring? Some of them, they have very different early spring flows or important peak flows or drawdown during the late spring and summer. So they've looked at hydrographs or water flows on these streams across the state, compared within each class, and come up with what they feel are the critical characteristics that identify these particularly the important characteristics for each of these streams. And then also think about how those characteristics link to the species that use them. So the first flush, that may be a cue for species that are migrating or moving into the streams, or the peak flows that do create enormous changes in terms of the geomorphology of creeks. So that was her description of that first tier. The second tier is then to take that and fine-tune it for individual locations or places and link it up more specifically to the biology. And that's what Eric Stein talked about. Eric Stein's from the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project in Southern California. He heads up their biological division. So he talked about his work in Southern California that doesn't focus on salmon or so much with fish within their streams, but more on the invertebrates that live within those streams, and understanding what are these hydrologic characteristics that invertebrates within the streams are likely associating with or being affected by. So Eric and his team at SQUIRP, or the water project in Southern California, have data from 800 streams in Southern California over about 10 years with invertebrate sampling over that. So it's an enormous, really impressive data set. And what they've done is using a bunch of multivariate statistical approaches, tried to take the same approach that Sarah's using in terms of characterizing the flow, and then link it to the biological communities. So see if the flows are impacted and you have lower peaks, how big of an effect does that have on the invertebrates? And so they're still in the process of developing these linkages, but they're trying to, I think they're making significant progress in making that strong connection between what are the flow characteristics that are there and how do the organisms respond. And so that's sort of a quick overview of Eric's talk. All of these talks are available on the web and at the council's website, and I would encourage you to look at them. I think they really, actually the first two I didn't see, they were before I was here, and I watched them on the web, and they were really informative and impressive overview. The last one was done by Carson Jeffries, who's here at UC Davis and is a fisheries biologist. And he was talking more about floodplain issues. So whereas Eric and Sarah, were focusing more on within the creek and within the streams, Carson really emphasized the importance of the connectivity of the flows and of those high flows that move out of the creeks into the adjacent floodplains. He used a phrase that I thought was great, where he referred to California in terms of rivers as the land of hell or high water, because he said we have such variable conditions. We either have long periods of drought where we have no water in our streams, or we have enormous crazy flows like we've had over the last year. And so what he was saying, and actually what Sarah and Eric also emphasized, in thinking about trying to manage these systems, we're not going to go back to historic natural flows, but we want to identify what are the critical characteristics that organisms are responding to that we do need to manage for. How do we get water up onto these floodplains? And so Carson highlighted the Yolo bypass as a great example of a managed floodplain where we are getting water up onto these floodplains, and we are able to, if we can manage the timing and the duration and the magnitude of those floods onto the floodplains, we can promote significant fish growth and significant fish recruitment. So I think his really take-home message was really thinking about habitat connectivity, thinking about connectivity between the river systems and the floodplains, and then incorporating what Sarah and Eric had talked about in terms of what is truly the appropriate hydrology or the critical aspects of the hydrology that we need to improve conditions for fish in those systems. So let's see, that's those are the three talks that we included. In terms of the last two items, I'll just briefly mention the science program and the Stewardship Council supported just recently in the end of August, the Delta Invasive Species Symposium. It was a booming success, I would say. There were over 150 attendees and 9 presentations and 10 posters on invasive species, addressing a wide range of issues from using environmental DNA to monitor invasives, other tools that are being used. So the approach, this built on a previous symposium that was done a few years ago on invasive plants and sort of the state of the knowledge of invasive plants. This symposium that was organized by Maggie Chrisman on our staff was really focusing more on tools to understand and manage invasive species and reduce invasive species into the future. And as I said, it touched a wide range of different species, and I think really was a great opportunity for scientists and managers to get together to see what people are doing, how are they evaluating risk, how are they dealing with particular species, what can be applied from one species to the other across those different challenges of invasives. And then the last thing to point out is a particular poster that's here from that symposium. That was a poster on the California Aquatic Invasive Species Management Plan that was completed in 2008 initially and is now up for a review and modification. And so this was just the poster presents an overview, highlights some some issues that are there in your report. Over 600 aquatic invasive species in California. We really do have, one of the worst challenges in terms of invasives in our estuary of any estuary in the country, and so we really have to be mindful of how do we manage these species and how do we address that in a meaningful way. So the management plan is an attempt to identify and improve communication, set standards for compliance, and really incorporate citizen science and improve monitoring around the state. So that's all that I have to present. If there's any questions.
Yeah, John, I wasn't able to attend that conference, but I think a general question coming out of that would be, how are we doing on preventing new invaders, and how are we doing at managing the species that are already there that are of concern?
I think it's highly variable. I think we're doing much better in terms of awareness and prevention. So there was a talk on zebra mussels, and I thought that was interesting to see. So zebra mussels are an enormous problem in many areas, and other related mussels to zebra mussels, and they're here in California. But we've done a very good job with awareness of boaters, awareness of management agencies, and they haven't spread nearly as dramatically as people thought they might. So I think we are doing better. We're doing a lot with the ballast water initiatives to reduce those. So I think we've made progress in many of those areas. In terms of managing managing already established species, I think it's highly variable. But I would say certainly much more awareness and effort, and some examples. I would say that I don't know really of any good examples where we've gotten rid of an invasive species completely, but there are some good examples where we've managed them and reduced their impacts.
Just a couple of quick questions. Eric Stein's paper, he talks about and you talked about the impacts on invertebrates, and he talks about it in Southern California. Water quality, you were talking about water flow, John, and most of those are very intermittent types of streams, and these are real adaptive species. So, flow, not much you can do about that, and they adapt to that. But what are we talking about, like urban runoff in terms of managing water quality? Is that?
Yeah. So actually, Eric pointed out that their issues are very different. It's not so much dams and controlling flow, and in some cases, it's actually increased flow that's affected many of their systems because of increased use of imported water and other impacts. So they're looking at modifications to stream flow in a mix of ways. Some increased, some decreased.
Yeah, it seems like it's a hard thing to control down there. It's really random.
It is for sure.
On the coastal wetlands, the Gulf study, and I just wanted to point out something you talked about is sort of the changes in habitat that will occur, and that in the Gulf, but something we can expect to occur. I mean, changes in habitat also mean effects on the species that are in the existing habitats, which you would assume would be taken over and they would decline, and that may be, that seems to be like, if that's a trend, is that something we have to plan for in our restoration efforts? And does that work against, maybe species that ultimately are going to decline because of changes in habitat? And is that something that's talked about in your circles? So it's not like, gee, that's a species, and if they decline, the habitat's changed. It's evolution.
Yeah, so I would say, I would think of it more as, there definitely will be winners and losers as changes occur in climate. Things will decline in some places, but increase in others. So there's more likely to be shifts and migration, movement. But yes, certainly, the concerns, some of the predictions within the Bay are as things warm up, as precipitation changes, there will be salinity shifts, and species will migrate up or down the estuary as those salinity shifts occur. And so Sassoon Bay, that's now low salinity, may become much more like the North Bay and San Francisco Bay with higher salinities, and the western part of the delta may become more like Sassoon Bay over multiple decades. So those shifts people are definitely aware of.
So as we start to think about an ecosystem amendment to the Delta Plan, does sea level rise and climate change play a big part in how we start to think about where restoration occurs? And maybe I'm just kind of putting it out for future thought.
Most certainly. And I would say that's one thing that for the ecosystem amendment that we're very aware of and trying to really incorporate into the thinking, so that it looks at not just restoring for current conditions, but restoring for conditions into the future.
Okay.
And that is one thing in the 2013 plan that the council was fairly prescient about, is we have maps and actually regulations that look at the impact of future sea level rise on where we locate high priority restoration projects. But we realize now that we have a lot more to do on that front.
I knew you would. Last question, I'll make it quick. Just on the land use paper, I just thought it was interesting with enhanced agriculture, and I'll defer to the chair as our in-house expert on making market-based decisions on what to plant. I mean, how much, in that enhancement did that play? Or were they looking at, these are things that we know will have a positive impact on the environment, regardless of whether it's going to be a smart business move for farmers to do?
Yeah, they did not. It was just a sample scenario. So they intentionally chose shifts. There was some consideration. So they did say, we're not going to replace vineyards that may be bringing in more income with something that's going to bring in less. So it was conversion of existing grasslands or other lower value ag with
just something that had value.
Yeah.
As a minimum. Okay, that's all. I just know that market decisions are what drives what gets planted.
Okay, thank you. So now we have by the numbers.
Yes, we
by
do.
Catherine Courtier.
Welcome, Catherine.
Good morning, council members and Chair Fiorini. So this month for our numbers, we yet again have mostly really nice green numbers, starting off with precipitation. As you know, we really haven't had much change in precipitation in the past 4 months, but that should be changing relatively soon as we get more rain and hopefully some more snow. So moving on to water temperature, this is the newest section of the numbers that we have started presenting on. If you will see that the numbers are actually in black instead of a color, and I believe last month for the By the Numbers report, I said that we were still kind of working on a scoring mechanism for that, and after consulting with our new lead scientist, John, and with a couple other people, we decided that it would be best just to leave the numbers in black, because comparing current monthly averages to the historical average and pulling out a percentage doesn't really make sense for the temperature. So what we're going to be doing for the water temperature is that in months when there's no snowpack to report, which is July to October, we'll give you these 3 water temperatures. And just to put it in some historical context, Clear Creek is currently at 57 degrees, and the 20-year September average for that is also 57 degrees. So we've seen that's kind of stayed fairly constant over the years. For Collinsville, currently at 67 degrees, and this one, the data set is only a 6-year average, and so that's compared to 69 degrees. And, with some of these lower temperatures, it's most likely due to the fact that we've had warmer weather this summer and it's increased the snowmelt. So in addition to making the water temperature a little lower, this is also kind of calls into question what's going to happen as we move into fall and winter with what our remaining snowpack will be. Clifton Court has a current temperature of 69 degrees and a 7-year average of 73 degrees. So for each of these stations, the measurements of the water temperature are taken hourly, and so from those hourly measurements, I've compiled monthly and then yearly and then long-term averages. So it's quite a large data set, which was interesting to kind of look through and see some of the variance of season to season and year to year. So next month will be the last month we're going to report water temperature, and I hope to have some histograms for you just to kind of show some of the interesting changes that we've had over the years and even over the seasons for all 3 of those water points. So moving on to water supply, with the exception of Oroville, where of course we are still having some construction, all of the numbers are well above the 100% mark and are vastly better than they were for the past 2 years. So, in 2015, we were seeing very low values for our storage down into the low 40s. Moving on to flow, we also have all of our values that are well above 100%. We're seeing, really high numbers at San Joaquin at 189, and similarly to our reservoir storage for, 2015 and 16 with the drought, we were seeing very low numbers. At the lowest point, we had values in the 10s. In 2015 and 2016, things increased slightly to the low hundreds, and now we're seeing much greater values closer to 200. Salinity, similarly, we're seeing some of our lowest values in the past 4 years. All values are, with the exception of Vernalis, which is slightly higher at 332, are very low as compared to their past 3 to 4 year averages, which were in the high 600 to 700. So it's really nice to see that. This month, we are just reporting on one fish number, which is the summer tow net survey for striped bass. And so this is a survey for age 0 striped bass, and it's the abundant index, and the index for this year is 4, which is the highest since 2000. But it is also the highest post-pod index value, so from 2002 till the present. And this summer tow net survey is conducted on alternating weeks from June to August 31st. And the index is calculated using data from the 2 surveys bracketing the date when the age 2 to 0 striped bass reach or surpass a mean fork length of 38.1. So here we have the chart of the years of the index survey, and then the kind of inset is just since 2008. And below that on the bottom of the page is just a map of the various survey stations. So that is it for By the Numbers, if anyone has questions.
Questions for Catherine? No. Thank you very much.
That concludes our report.
Great. Thank you, John. Any requests for public comment? Very good. We're completed file item number 8. Now on to file item number 9. Jessica?
Okay. Well, today we have a representative from the Department of Water Resources who's going to discuss the 2017 update to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. Council staff are also here to discuss the relevance and the coordination with the Delta Levy investment strategy. And then we have a representative from American Rivers who's going to provide a non-governmental organization perspective on flood management projects and how they can implement long-term habitat restoration measures to achieve multiple benefits. I think with that, I'll turn it over to our staff, Erin Mullen.
Good morning. To those of you that haven't met me yet, my name is Erin Mullen. I'm a senior engineer with the Planning Division. I work under Dustin. He was going to be presenting this month, but he is in Washington, D.C. enjoying the beautiful weather, I hope. So I'm taking this on. The purpose of today's presentation is to brief the Council on the 2017 update to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, including an overview of its content and development, and to facilitate discussions that may inform the Council's development or refinement of future Delta Plan amendments. Here to talk we have Mike Mearswa, who is the lead flood management planner for DWR. He asked me not to call him chief, so I just skipped over my notes a little bit. He will provide an update on or an overview of the 2017 CVFPP update, and John Kane, who is the Director of Conservation for California Flood Management, American Rivers, who will provide a non-governmental organizational perspective on flood management projects, long-term habitat restoration, and multi-benefit projects. Just to give a little background on this effort, the Flood Board adopted the 2017 Flood Plan Update at its August 25th meeting. The adopted update included the 2017 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan Update, as well as the 2016 Conservation Strategy and associated appendices. As you know, the 2009 Delta Reform Act directed the Council, in consultation with the Flood Board, to recommend priorities for state investment in levee operation, maintenance, and improvements in the Delta, including both levees that are part of the State Plan of Flood Control and non-project levees. The 2017 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan addresses flood risk reduction, ecosystem enhancement, and investment strategies for the State Plan of Flood Control levees, including the project levees located in the Delta. As the Council moves forward with its proposed amendments to the Delta Plan, Council staff anticipates that the 2017 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan update and the conservation strategy will be included in the documents that will assist with its development, and interagency coordination is critical for both of our successes. And with that, I think we'll hand it over to Mike.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the Council. My name is Mike Mears with California Department of Water Resources.
The button, there you go.
There we go. I will repeat that. Again, good morning, Chairman, members of the Council. Again, my name is Mike Mearswa with DWR, and I'm happy to be here today to share with you a quick overview of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. Certainly we are interested if you have more detailed questions and comments on some of the supporting information and coming back in the future and sharing that information with you. Just to provide a little bit of perspective out there, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan covers an area that is roughly the size of the state of Florida. It's a very expansive area out there, and there are a number of features in it. In 2007, with the passage of SB 5, the term State Plan of Flood Control was used to begin to describe the state, federal project levees within the Central Valley of California. In context, the state of California has about 14,000 miles of levees. The majority of those are locally owned. Within that larger subset of numbers, there are 1,600 miles of state federal levees, which are the State Plan of Flood Control levees. There are additional state federal levees that are not part of the State Flood Control that are located within California, and there are some of those south of Fresno within the Central Valley. The Central Valley's flood control system includes an extensive system of bypasses and floodways, 2 completely different river basins, and I think you can see, get some sense of scale of that with this graphic here taken from National Geographic that gives you an expansive area there in the Central Valley, showing in green all of the irrigated agricultural areas of the Central Valley, and in blue are all of the waterways that are sitting out there, both the natural and man-made system. And then behind the Central Valley there, you're looking at the Sierra Nevada range, where you can get a sense of scale of the appreciation of the elevation differences from the north to the south, which leads to the character of the Sacramento and the San Joaquin River basins being so completely different from each other. Within each of those rivers, there are 5 major tributaries. There are also 5 major urban centers located within the Central Valley, dozens of small communities, dozens of endangered species, currently 1.3 million people who live in the floodplains, although I like to caveat that number and remind people that there are probably a factor of 3 times as many people who actually work in the floodplains. I'm an example of one who doesn't live in a floodplain, but my livelihood depends on being able to come here into the city of Sacramento and work. And currently there's about $80 billion of property and assets at risk within the Central Valley. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, as I had mentioned earlier, was started in 2007 with Senate Bill 5, which was adopted in 2008. It is required to be updated every 5 years. The 2017 update to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is the first major update of that plan and results in some refinements to the work that was conducted from 2007 through 2012. The graphic that you're looking at here shows on the left some of the analyses that were conducted, the summary of those results from a cost perspective and a benefit perspective for the 3 fundamental approaches that were called forth in the legislation for us to look through, and I'll highlight those for a second. The bottom axis describes the primary goal as outlined and Senate Bill 5, which is actually a flood risk reduction objective out there. As the bubbles that you're looking at there on the left, the blue, the orange, and the green, move further towards the right, we're indicating that we can achieve more flood risk reduction benefits based off of a portfolio of actions. The vertical axis, has the 4 supporting goals that were also called out in the legislation, which are to actually address operations and maintenance, ecosystem improvements, identify multi-benefit projects, and then finally to address governance and institutional support considerations. So as the bubbles move higher along that vertical axis, we also in 2012 assessed that we were able to better achieve those objectives. Now the size of the bubbles is a little problematic in that as the bubbles get larger, that represents a larger cost to go through and achieve those objectives over time. In 2012, the time frame at which we could achieve each of those objectives was different based off of what we thought we could do based off of those portfolio of actions, and they range from the smallest implementation in the orange, there being a 10-year implementation, to being about 40 years in the larger green bubble. The cost for each of these scenarios also varied, which led the state in 2012 to adopt a state system-wide investment approach, which is the blue, orange, green bar there in the middle. In 2012, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan's high-end estimate of cost was $17 billion. With our update in 2012, we added several new technical analyses. You probably won't be able to see those in the right-hand graphic out there, but we had a conservation strategy. We had an operations maintenance repair, rehabilitation replacement report. We entered into contracts with local agencies in the Central Valley to have 6 different regional flood management plans that were incorporated in there, where we took from a bottom-up approach a list of other project activities that could be included within the plan. And then finally, we had 2 separate basin-wide feasibility studies, one for the Sacramento Basin and one for the San Joaquin Basin. Based off of those 4 foundational work efforts, the objectives of improving flood risk as well as achieving the secondary objectives were increased for only a modest cost increase there, where the blue bubble now in the 2017 update represents about $21 billion over the next 30 years. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is intended to link into the state's overall investment infrastructure plans. This graphic shows how the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan ties into both the overall state flood management investment reports and ultimately how this information could be used to inform the annual California 5-year infrastructure investment plan for the legislature. What you're looking at the top is a thumbnail of the 2012 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, where there was a total investment of $17 billion, and at the time, a state cost share of about $8 billion. The next icon there from 2013 is a statewide flood investment report, where we estimated back in 2013 that there were $50 billion worth of capital improvements that were shovel-ready across the state to be implemented. With our update of the plan, the $21 billion now has a larger state cost share representing $12 billion. And we have gone and updated the cost estimates across the state from $50 billion to $80 billion, in part using the cost escalation that we've seen with the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, plus additional conversations the Department of Water Resources has had with over an additional 100 local agencies in the state. Together, these cost estimates are intended to go through and inform what is the overall needed investment in the state of California for flood management infrastructure. As you can see from the 2017 5-year infrastructure investment report, that information is not completely getting in there, where the state estimated $43 billion of publicly owned infrastructure that need to be invested in, $40 billion of which was in the transportation sector. So the intent is for the department to take the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, our statewide reports as we update those on 5-year bases, and use that information to give the legislature a more concrete idea of what's needed in the next 5 years for investing in our public infrastructure. Getting into a little bit more detail as to the cost breakdowns in there, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan included capital and ongoing costs over a 30-year time horizon. That 30-year time horizon was based off of basically what would be a reasonable rate of return on your investments. When you begin to look beyond 30 years, the present value of those future investments begin to become trivial. This is a standard number that often shows up in other federal studies as well. We also looked and broke our cost estimates between 4 different discrete areas of interest to represent different things we're trying to accomplish within the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. First, we looked at the system-wide interest, the things that the state principally is the leader of implementing and cost sharing on. We also looked at urban areas, rural areas, and small community areas. And as you can see here, we've broken the cost for both the Sacramento and San Joaquin basins and high and low ranges and provided a total for both of those basins combined, giving us a cost range between $17 and $21 billion. And for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to focus in on that higher cost estimate there of $21 billion. Getting into a little bit more detail there, an example of statewide actions had a $9 billion investment. The actions that we're talking about here include improvements to the bypasses, reservoir operations, as well as opportunities to seek floodplain storage. There are ongoing costs that also included emergency management and routine maintenance costs. And then these overall investment in system-wide actions bolster our long-term resiliency as a complement to the smaller scale actions that are covered in the other 3 items from the previous slide. Just a physical sense of 2 examples of some of the large-scale system improvements. On the left, you're looking at our vision for improvements within the Yola bypass out there. These are both flood risk reduction and ecosystem improvements out there. That actually is a series of individual projects that will be implemented over the next 30 years. Currently, we are working on the lower Elkhorn Basin just to the west of the city of Sacramento here and to the north of the Sacramento Weir and bypass. And then the graphic on the right actually is a San Joaquin River bypass located just to the south of the city of Stockton on Paradise Cut that would reduce the floodwaters as they pass through the San Joaquin River and pass through the urban communities of Manteca, Lathrop, and Stockton by allowing that water to move through the delta. And again, this graphic depicts both some of the flood risk reduction and ecosystem features that are envisioned within the plan on that. Both of these features would require detailed project designs for the incremental projects that come out. And so the intent of the plan was not to authorize the projects, but instead to talk about the outcomes and the investment needed to achieve these types of projects over time. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan did, with its 2017 update, was based on increased modeling detail here. This is a graphic of the Sacramento Basin showing basically the spatial resolution of the impact areas or basins as we modeled water coming through the levees or over the levees into the areas to assess what the damages would be with or without the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. And here you can see in 2012 we used a Central Valley hydrology study model, and with the 2017 update we have a Central Valley floodplain evaluation delineation model. This is really the first time that we can model water coming from the entire Central Valley watershed in a physically based real-time system all the way through the river channels, floodplains, out to the ocean. And I think this is a pretty major significant accomplishment that really isn't highlighted within the plan but buried within our technical appendices. The detailed operations and maintenance, repair, rehabilitation, and replacement report was made in conjunction with stakeholders. It was based actually also off a lot of information coming from DWR's Delta Levees programs, both our special projects and subventions programs. In here, we talked about the age of structures and the current funding gap. The walkaway message is that we found right now local agencies in the state of California are spending about $30 million per year for maintenance activities, but to actually meet what is legislatively required of all of these agencies, we should be spending a minimum of $130 million per year. In context, Harris County, Texas, Flood Control District spends $100 million per year just for the maintenance of that particular community's flood management system. The graphic that you're looking at on the right here shows in 1950 the cost of maintaining the systems based off of 1950s control manuals. In 2016, you'll see these little icons of money bags with other color shaded costs out there. These are all of the unfunded mandates that we are asking our flood management system to incorporate and to achieve over time, and is part of the basis for that $130 million annual estimate. Part of the governor's executive order B3015, Governor Brown called upon state agencies to incorporate life cycle cost estimates into our investment decisions. Often, planning documents have focused in on the capital improvements, which is what we did in 2012. But with the O&M report, we have also looked at talking about the costs of both routine operations and maintenance, these annual costs, as well as the unusual or unanticipated costs associated with repairs, rehabilitation, and recovery of events, which we unfortunately did get to experience this water year. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan does include both the routine operations and maintenance costs, and we do have estimated costs for what would be to repair or recover our facilities for several 1997-like flood events. The one set of costs that aren't included in our cost estimates is the cost of retiring and replacing our structures. Something that is very important is when we're going through and making investments in the future is to actually estimate a design life associated with these structures. Are these levees designed to last 20 years, 50 years, or 100 years? And the reason that's important in investment planning is we need to know when they're near the end of their design life so we can begin in the next planning cycle to incorporate what the costs are of replacing those structures with something else that meets the current needs at that time. The conservation strategy had many concepts within it. This graphic right here talks about, I think, what is perhaps the most important concept in there, which is the need for actually setting back our levees and making room for our rivers. The levee system on the top is a cartoon depiction of our present system where we ask a lot of our rivers through narrow corridors to actually manage and move floodwaters through, which puts stress both on the levees and can lead to even greater damages when the waters eventually will pass over or through those levees. By setting back our levees, which is the graphic on the bottom, not only do we have the opportunity to reconnect to our floodplains and achieve ecosystem benefits, but we can reduce the pressure on our levees, which reduces the annual costs of going through and maintaining these levee systems over time. The conservation strategy also had detailed work as to some measurable objectives for long-term needs and opportunities for ecosystem improvements, which supports our secondary goals within the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. We had detailed work to actually address the concurrence of sea level rise based impacts of storm surge concurrent with floodwaters coming through the system. This graphic here just depicts some of the modeling technique where we did go out to the Golden Gate and incorporate future mid and late century sea level rise projections to actually talk about and describe what the backwater effects would be when floodwaters would be moving through our system. That's something that we could be happy to give a more detailed discussion in the future on, but I did want to bring that to the council because I thought it'd be something you would be interested in, and I think it is an area of future collaboration. One of the more unique things that we have presented within the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is instead of talking about a traditional Army Corps of Engineers benefit cost ratio, is we've actually focused in on the value of life loss reductions that we can achieve by having a well-maintained and improved flood management system here. What you're looking at is from 2007 through 2067, projections of what the annual expected life loss is within the entire Sacramento River Basin is based on having a Central Valley Flood Protection Plan in green versus not having a Central Valley Flood Protection Plan in blue. This demonstrates some of the early returns and value of our investments made with the Proposition 1E and 84, where in 2007, the annual expected life loss in the Sacramento River Basin was expected to be around 290 lives per year. But with the early implementation program and the first decade of investments the state, local agencies, and the federal government have made, we've cut that number down by 3/4 to about 66 lives per year. Some of the work that we're doing now here, and I think this was demonstrated by the successful management of floodwaters in January and February of this year, the expected annual life loss has dropped down to about 22. Now, as the population continues to grow, those numbers with or without the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan will increase. And so the investments that are envisioned within this 2017 update can drop that expected increase from 141 down to 43 lives per year. The numbers for the San Joaquin Basin are actually much more optimistic, where the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan can actually reverse the future trends of expected life loss there, and that's detailed in the same section within the plan. A concept that I wanted to talk about that isn't really embedded in the plan but is the basis of the plan were these river basin planning concept and golden rules, which were based off of UNESCO, the United nation's educational and scientific organizations document on good planning principles and policies. Two that I really wanted to call out into attention here was the recognition that planning processes are often iterative and chaotic. That is the logic in having a 5-year updates to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, and the reason why my team's already working on scoping out the 2022 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. And also one of my favorite rules that came out of the River Basin Planning Guidance is the importance of engaging stakeholders with a view to strengthening the institutional relationships. In other words, it really takes a village to raise a child out here, and by having a strong communications and engagement process, which we did in 2017, and by incorporating the stakeholder feedback out there, the likelihood of success of achieving the outcomes that are set forth in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is much higher. There were 8 key policy areas that were identified in the plan, and I'll read those off, but I won't get into details on those. In those, we talked about land use and floodplain management policies and recommendations. We talked about residual risk management policies, hydraulic ecosystem baselines and program phasing considerations. We talked about operations and maintenance of the flood system, the need for development of multi-benefit projects in the Central Valley, effective governance and institutional support, and then finally coordination with federal agencies, and then finance. Getting into the finance, and this is one of the areas where I thought we had some of the most significant and repeated stakeholder comments, is how are we going to actually achieve over 30 years, $21 billion of funding. We did go through and look at both the state, federal, and local cost shares. These are the general mechanisms that we've outlined in a detailed investment strategy, which we could come and share with you in the future. There are 3 new mechanisms that we've looked at. First is a reestablishment of the existing Sacramento-San Joaquin Drainage District, which is administered by the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. We also talked about, in conjunction with the California Water Plan, of the feasibility of a state river basin assessment in which water actions within river basins would be assessed and then managed through those basins. This would just be a small contribution to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. And then we've talked about studying the feasibility of a state flood insurance program, which could pass cost savings on to Californians who right now are subsidizing flood insurance and damages across the United States. I will at this point add that right now the cost estimates of the overlays to the National Flood Insurance Program for Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria is somewhere between $50 and $100 billion. And then at the federal level, we do in our documents talk about the Army Corps programs, in addition to the federal emergency management programs and other federal ecosystem programs, such as those with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. I was surprised in development of the 2017 plan that the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, actually is a very large cost share contributor to proactive and reactive and recovery operations within the state of California. And you'll be able to get a better glimpse of that when you look at the investment strategy. The plan did go through and talk about a series of comprehensive approaches within DWR's program activities on how we can better manage flood risk within the Central Valley. I'm not going to get into the details of this graphic other than describe that there are 5 mega programs. Traditionally, the public is very focused in on the flood risk reduction projects, which is the first of the brown wedges that you see there off to the right. They also do understand the need for flood system operations and maintenance. This year was a hallmark year for flood emergency response actions at the local, state, and federal levels. And I represent the 2 green areas on the top, which is the flood management planning activities, where we seek cost efficiencies and the ability to go through and identify what the opportunities are in the future, as well as floodplain risk management, where we're preventing the intensification of risks in the future to protect future generations. The bullets around that side, which I'd be happy to talk to you later, are lists of some of the named programs that DWR currently has to go through and implement actions within each of those mega program areas. So this is my last slide. In summary, strategic planning can be used to inform decisions, especially with regard to large systems or watershed assessments, which really require flexibility and refinement. It's very difficult to go through and assess what you can do within an area the size of the state of Florida. However, if you look at the outcomes and not get focused in on individual projects, you can come up with some really solid order of magnitude cost estimates and opportunities that exist out there that then can inform all of those individual programs that I showed on the previous wheel or slide. No plan is perfect, but the difference in between what we intend to get with each iteration of the flood plan, our intended outcome, and the actual outcome we achieve is invaluable in helping us learn how to strategically address our enabling conditions. This is both the policy world of those 8 policy items I spoke to, as well as the resourcing, the staff and financial needs that we all need to actually achieve the plan over time. And then finally, implementing partner and stakeholder ownership to the ideas and recommendations in the plan ultimately lead to a more productive set of outcomes. Thank you.
Mike, thank you. If it pleases the council, I think we can hear from John and then enter into questions. And John, before you begin, I wanted to point out that Cindy Messer, the Chief Deputy of the Department of Water Resources, is here, and Leslie Gallagher, the Executive Officer of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, is here with us. Welcome. John, last time I saw you, we were standing on a levee near Paradise Cut. You're wearing a tie today.
Is the sound going to work? I think so. That's okay. Yeah, thanks. It's good to be here, even though I had to put on a tie. First of all, I just want to introduce American Rivers. We're a national nonprofit river conservation organization that works to protect and restore rivers for fish, wildlife, and people. And flood management is a really important issue. It was, I like to say that when it comes to managing rivers at American Rivers, we believe that public safety is the #1 priority, because how could it be any differently? Of course, we care about ecosystem restoration issues, and we've gotten involved in the flood management activities because we wanted to see a flood management program that could both make our communities and our rivers more resilient to floods and a changing climate. Also say that although I'm not here representing the larger conservation community, I have been working with a group of conservation organizations. We actually call ourselves the Central Valley Study Group. And we meet every Monday morning and have been doing so now for 6 years to talk about the Central Valley flood management planning issues and what we want and how we can work with DWR to get that. I was some of the other organizations, there's at least there's 15 organizations that participate in this group, and there's 10 that call in on a regular basis. I was lucky enough to be able to attend the late August late August meeting of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, where the board adopted the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. And it was just a love fest. Everybody was thankful and happy. The Farm Bureau was accounted for, the reclamation districts, the Central Valley Flood Control Association, and several NGOs had nothing but good things to say about what DWR and the board was able to accomplish. And the board had nothing but good things to say about how all the stakeholders worked well together, helping pull it together. So we're very happy with the plan. I wanted to just kind of highlight 3 issues that I think that describe the plan. One is risk management. The second is outcome-based. And the third is multi-benefit flood management. And at American Rivers, we believe that the best way to protect communities from flood risk, improve the kind of outcomes we want from flood risk management, is to give rivers more room to safely convey flood flows. And that one of the best ways to do this is through multi-benefit flood management projects. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what these all mean. I I think some of you may know this, but I've had to remind my father-in-law that I don't work on flood control. I work on flood risk management. That's where we're focusing not just on the probability of floods and trying to limit the probability of floods, we're also trying to limit the consequences of flooding. And we will never be able to eliminate all of the consequences from catastrophic floods, but there are many, many things we can do to reduce those risks over time. And the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan lays out a portfolio of risk management strategies. One of the most important flood risk management strategies is floodplain management. Don't build on floodplains, don't build on dangerous floodplains. I think some of you remember that was a key factor that brought parties together, not only for the legislation to create the Central Valley Flood Management Plan and the reconstituted Central Valley Flood Protection Board, but also Delta Vision and the Delta Stewardship Council. The urbanization on the lowland floodplains in the early 2000s was something we were all really paying attention to. Of course, the housing bust sort of ended that for a while. We haven't thought a lot about urbanization of floodplains. The legislation created this new urban level of protection, which we were looking for areas that were of 10,000 people or larger, had to provide 200-year level of protection in order to allow continued building in their urban area. And on the rollout of the plan, Mike and I were fortunate enough to be on several media outlets, and one of the things that I brought up is while the issue of floodplain urbanization seems like it was kind of a resolved issue, the building boom is back. And so I just highlighted this issue on the radio broadcast, and I heard from a lot of people that indeed the building boom is back and that there are questions about whether we're doing a good enough job complying with the legal requirements of SB 5 to limit development on floodplains. It's my understanding that the local communities develop urban level of protection findings, that they are meeting the need to comply with, provide 200-year level of flood protection by the year 2025. And once they've made those findings, then they can continue permitting development. But there's not a clear process for reviewing those. The Central Valley Flood Protection Board has had this on their agenda, but it got canceled. It hasn't come up. One of the problems is that the question of adequate progress, they need to make adequate progress by 2025, is somewhat of a subjective question. There's the question of, are you engineering your levees right? Do you have a good engineering plan for your levees? And then there's the question of, are you going to be able to get the funding to do what you actually say you want to do by 2025, particularly if you're depending a lot on the federal government to come up with that funding. So I'm not going to say that it's not working. I'm just going to say that it's something that really deserves our attention. The second thing I wanted to say, so that's about risk, and there's lots of other good risk management strategies in the plan, but it really starts with not putting people in harm's way. The second point I wanted to make is that this is an outcome-based plan. It focuses on the desired outcomes that we want to achieve rather than a list of actions. And I'm very excited about this. It does mean that we have an iterative and chaotic planning process. I'm not sure it's going to be chaotic, but it means that instead of saying, here are the list of actions and we're going to build all these actions, it's saying, here are what we're trying to achieve. Bring to us the best ideas. Redesign your concepts and your projects to better achieve these outcomes. And that's the thing that ends up being an iterative process. We're very excited, and I would say all of the conservation community is very excited that the plan includes measurable conservation objectives in addition to measurable flood risk reduction objectives. And one of the reasons this was really the primary thing that the conservation organizations worked on. And one of the reasons it was so important to us is because we believe that modifying the flood system is is fundamental to the recovery of several endangered species. Without giving rivers more room, we are not going to be able to achieve both the outcomes of flood risk reduction and ecosystem recovery. And I don't think I've seen Mike's graphic on that before, but I love it. Thank you. And so on this idea that this is iterative, we know we've identified the outcomes, and now the future design and investment decisions should be guided by an analysis of the extent to which different projects, different designs, different investments advance those outcomes. And that gets complicated when I talk about the third element of the plan, which is multi-benefit projects. The plan actually has a definition for multiple benefit projects that we discussed quite a bit. It's to reduce flood risk. It's to reduce flood risk and improve habitat for fish and wildlife, as well as advancing other benefits. But there's two prerequisites: flood risk reduction and improvement in habitat, as well as other benefits like recreation, open space, groundwater recharge, water supply, etc. One of the reasons it just is more difficult to design and finance a multi-benefit project. You have to figure out, you have to get more people working together, more agencies chipping in, and we live in a world where we're kind of coming out of single-purpose projects where each organization says, well, we can only play for the flood risk part of it, and they go down a design path, and inevitably it's a flood risk reduction project instead of a multi-benefit project. And so that's figuring out how to challenge and permit these multi-benefit projects and integrate them into the objective-based planning paradigm is going to be a challenge going forward. Fortunately, we're making really good progress. I say we, the state of California and the various stakeholders. It's not just an idea, but as Mike was saying, there's major progress defining what we can do in the Yolo bypass, not just on the biological opinion, but the Lower Elkhorn project. And I believe that there's going to be a CEQA NEPA document out on that by the end of the year. Is that rough? So we're moving forward. That would be a draft NEPA CEQA document. The city of West Sacramento is under construction on a very exciting levee setback project that will create somewhere on the order of 200 acres of frequently inundated floodplain habitat walking distance from here. And this habitat will be really good for winter-run Chinook salmon. There's still some issues that need to be worked out to exactly how will the city of West Sacramento or the West Sacramento Flood Control Agency get credits for the habitat they're creating, and that's very important to them. Some kind of advanced mitigation credits. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Paradise Cut, but that's a project that, and then there's at least a dozen other projects that are very far along in the design and permitting process up and down the valley, including Hamilton City. We are actually doing these multi-benefit flood management projects. It's not just a dream. So lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the Paradise Cut project. We, American Rivers, actually has obtained grants from the Delta Conservancy and the Department of Fish and Wildlife totaling $4 million to start the acquisition process in the footprint of the Paradise Cut that you saw on slide 8 here. Thanks for having that up in front of you. And by the way, that footprint is very consistent with the footprint in the Delta Stewardship Council's Delta plan for Paradise Cut. And so that is it's going well. We've been in negotiations with landowners about purchasing flood easements. The land will continue in private ownership and in agriculture as identified in the plan, and there's no opposition to the plan. But there are challenges moving forward. One of the challenges we have is one of the key pieces of property out there, 1,100 of the 2,000 acres that needs to be acquired, actually has an agricultural conservation easement on it. And this agricultural conservation easement could preclude the holder of that easement, the Central Valley Farmland Trust, from providing permission to do this this flood bypass. I hope to talk to you and your staff more about this issue, but it really speaks to a larger problem, which is how are we going to do flood management friendly, wildlife friendly agriculture? How are we going to create more of a multi-benefit landscape? Because the particular easements that are written and the particular laws that we have send us down a different pathway. For example, this easement says you can't do anything to restrict or impair the agricultural use of the property. Fortunately, the Central Valley Farmland Trust has been very helpful and professional on this, and we are now convening an expert panel to help us understand what are the legal and technical opportunities to resolve this problem promptly. So with that, thank you very much for having us present today.
Yes, thank you, John. Questions of the panelists? Oh, and since you called out the Conservancy, I should also point out that Campbell Ingram, the executive officer of the Delta Conservancy, is here with us. This panel has achieved a great deal of interest from high-level agency representatives. Questions from the Patrick?
What are the measurable conservation goals?
Why don't you go ahead and turn that one off? Well, I'll just say there's not a short answer. But one of the things is I'll use the different language than they use, but increase the area of frequently inundated seasonal floodplain habitat. We actually have American Rivers worked in partnership with a graduate student at UC Berkeley and DWR to identify a new metric called the expected annual floodplain habitat. And then the DWR team worked in collaboration with the Fish and Wildlife agencies to develop several other metrics of ecosystem improvement.
Okay. In Table 2.1 of the plan, we have a list of all of the actual outcomes as well as the metrics that we believe that we can track over time to each of those outcomes. Within the ecosystem realm, we had 3 outcomes, and the first was reducing stressors on the riverine and floodplain ecosystems. For metrics there, one of the metrics we proposed was actually counting the acreage of non-native plant species that have been removed. Another one of the metrics that we've presented within the plan is the number of priority fish passage barriers that have been improved or removed over time. And within the plan, we also list the data source. These are the programs, literally, that we'd be working with to get that information. So going to the number of non-native plant species, it's a DWR working, we put reclamation, meaning the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation there. We have the Cal, IPC, and then we had various local agencies to go out and do the counts. And the number of fish barriers, we had Calfish, they have a passage assessment database. So this is Department of Cal Fish and Wildlife utilizing their database to identify those structures over time. The other 2 broad categories we had were improving riverine and floodplain habitats and ecosystems, and then a catch-all, which was increase and maintain the abundancy and diversity of floodplain-dependent native species. Now, this is what's actually in the document of the plan itself. When you go into the conservation strategy, there were 17 species that were identified within the entire Central Valley planning area. And the areas which each of those species is threatened or endangered, we've listed those out. And for each of those species within those areas, the conservation strategy identified these measurable objectives, which is really talking about getting the species counts up based off of whatever is lower, meaning more realistic. That would be either the need to get that species to rebound or the opportunity that presents itself within that area. So the reason that there would be some cases where we would actually be settling for less than the need going for this opportunity is we would have felt that within 30 years' time, it would have been too difficult to get all of what's needed out there. However, with the updates of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, we'll continually be also going back to the conservation strategy, and as additional species get listed or species get delisted, updating the information around that. And then as we're also developing what those project opportunities are out there, that opportunity bar over time can grow within the conservation strategy. So the goal or metric that sits within the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan itself will move to a degree to accommodate the fact that we're trying to hit these moving targets. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, under its objectives of tracking hydraulic and ecosystem baselines, commits to in the future using the flood system status report in reporting how we've actually achieved these objectives, not just the ones in Table 2.1, but the more detailed objectives that are listed within the conservation strategy itself.
So DWR will look at the measurable targets and do the counts and then evaluate over time how it's working?
Right. We're working on the work plan for what it would cost and resources to go through and do those field surveys, collecting that information, reporting on that in coordination with other state and federal agencies.
When you're presented with proposals for enhanced flood protection, how does this document help you decide what projects to pursue?
Right. So in the first half of that, when we're going through and developing the programs, part of the development of the reward criteria or the points associated with the guidelines is intended to reward project proponents for utilizing and seeking those opportunities out there, similar to what John was speaking towards. When we're going through and selecting the projects that were presented to us, the guidelines should rank the priority of those projects out there. Where the discretion comes with the state is to decide what is a good cutoff point. So if we're seeing that the majority of the projects are achieving that, but we have a limited amount of funding out there, the projects that are going to tend to achieve more of the guideline objectives, which would have been based off of these conservation metrics, will score higher. So that's the projects that would be rewarded first. The projects that would not be rewarded, we would either A, go back to the project proponents and ask them to reformulate the projects so they could be more competitive in the future, or B, rely on a future grant program to go through and pick up.
So what you described, are you doing that now? Is it the plan to do it in the future? Have you done it in the past?
It has been incorporated in the past for programs, but right now with the Yolo Bypass and the Lower Elkhorn Basin project, the graphic that I showed incorporated ecosystem features out there, and those ecosystem features, we have specific metrics within the conservation strategy where we list what we can actually achieve for the Lower Elkhorn Basin project within the plan. Now that we're getting into the design work for Lower Elkhorn, which I think is where the question is, when shovels hit the ground, when we're really talking about what we're achieving, we're going back and also utilizing the conservation strategy to incorporate what the ecosystem design features can be within that multi-benefit project.
And when you get outside the Yolo bypass, how has DWR evaluated proposals for flood protection and conservation objectives? Mike, John, both.
I'll take a first shot.
Well, you're asking good, difficult questions. I will say that I think that the funding guidelines that DWR has had previously creates incentives for parties that have multi-benefit projects, really pretty strong incentives, and so those are the kind of projects that have risen to the top.
Really? And you and the other groups you mentioned have evaluated that and determined that those projects have had multi-benefit aspects to them?
Well, yes, to some extent. There haven't been that many funding rounds, which is part of the issue. As I said before, though, and I know from talking to the people at West Sacramento, there was really an incentive for the levee setback there, an incentive that your council helped create. I know that we worked with the Sutter Buttes Flood Control Agency, first in an adversarial role and then in a collaborative role, to advance a project that's getting funded called the Oroville Wildlife Area. A lot of the funding for these kind of projects has come from, say, the Department of Fish and Wildlife or the Wildlife Conservation Board, but DWR staff has really helped pull those projects together. One is for the community of Firebaugh, another one is at a place called Grassland State Park. So these things are happening. But you're asking all the right questions about exactly how are we going to make decisions about how to fund these projects. And at a certain point...
Because a frequently stated objection to multi-benefit projects from reclamation districts is that, and sometimes from DWR individuals, is that we have limited money. We want to protect against the risk of flood. So if you want to do anything environmental, find another funding source. But the property owners, the reclamation district, and DWR itself don't see it as their priority to do.
We have not gotten over that hurdle yet, but it's looking promising. I think we had quite a bit of discussion in this. We had a subcommittee of the flood board called the Conservation Advisory Subcommittee, and the Central Valley Flood Control Association and the Farm Bureau participated along with fishery agencies and NGOs, and we had a discussion very much about these issues. And one of the first questions was, can we even achieve these objectives? Are these conservation objectives you've laid out even possible? We had discussions about that there are going to be projects, particularly in the Stockton area, that are going to be single-purpose projects. Hopefully we can get creative and figure out how to package them with a larger system of improvements. But we've also started to have, through these conversations, we've had partners come forward and say, we got this great project. So we're now working with groups like the Lower San Joaquin Levee District. All they've done is maintained kind of levees and floodways for decades. Now they're working with us on a project to remove a levee. So there are many, I could give you many examples of that happening, but we're just at the cusp of this change. It's a very exciting time, but we're not going to be able to make much progress if the parties we're working with are in a box with regard to what kind of projects their agencies allow them to plan in advance. And if they can only do single-purpose projects, and they can't even help us get the funding and take the extra time to make them multi-benefit, that's going to be a struggle. So we need a different institutional framework, a different kind of funding framework to advance multi-benefit projects. I know that some kind of water management fee is sort of the holy grail, but unless you have some kind of independent pot of funding that can facilitate integration, it's hard to get agencies to integrate.
Yeah, we used to call it the Division of Highways. Now we call it Caltrans. It has a larger vision. It took a long time for the culture to catch up with that. And
I didn't know that. That's an interesting analogy.
It is an analogy.
And I wanted to also respond to that. I don't think it's a completely fair characterization to say that the Department of Water Resources is really focused on single-purpose projects as opposed to multi-benefit projects. I think it depends on the individual program and that manager who you're working with, what might be said, but the department hasn't had a statement that they're opposed to the multi-benefit projects by any means. And I'll give some of the programs that now fall under my purview, under the Delta Levees programs, is we're seeking to go through on McCormick-Williamson tract and do some restoration opportunities out there. While that is certainly a flood benefit, what's really driving that project is the restoration activities and opportunities that sit out there as part of something that internally we refer to as a North Delta program. It's essentially something you should be familiar with as council members, an extension of the Consumnes River Preserve.
Others? John, you mentioned the concern about building in the floodplain, and I know you were much more involved here at the council when we were developing the Delta Plan. So I know that you're aware that one of our primary objectives was to prevent further harm, and that's why we have policies restricting development in high-priority restoration areas and placing new development in areas of flood risk. But I don't know if you're aware that our Covered Action Authority, and through early consultation, has led to the prevention of some developments. I'm thinking of one in particular in San Joaquin County, that if it hadn't been for the Delta Plan, there would have been more people placed at risk.
I wasn't aware of that. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. I'll try to learn more about that. Good job.
Yeah, I take an opportunity every time I can to speak of the importance of the Delta Plan and the utility that it has in fostering the good and appropriate things such as habitat restoration, riverine habitat in association with setback levees and flood risk management, but also preventing further harm. So yeah, take the opportunity to describe that. Speaking of the Delta Plan, Mike, I was impressed or depressed, I don't know which is the right word. You never mentioned the Delta Plan in your presentation. Was that an omission, or is there, maybe I guess I'll put it in the form of a question. What's the linkage between the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and the Delta Plan?
Right. Just because I didn't mention the Delta Plan doesn't mean that we weren't reviewing and reading and working with staff as these two plans were being developed in concert. I would first start with, there's actually multiple linkages. Obviously, there's the obvious one, which is included in the staff report, that in the 1,600 miles of levees that are part of the state plan of flood control system, 300 of those are actually within the legal boundaries of the Delta. So there is a connection and opportunity for the two plans working together on that sort of perspective. The second thing is the actions that are covered anywhere within the Delta Plan or within the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan do have the potential in the future to backwater or pass through flows through either of those two planning areas. So there's a nexus of what happens outside as the water doesn't respect plan boundaries and moves through the entire system. Getting within some of the specifics, we did look again through some of the land use policies as they were being developed into the draft Delta Levy investment strategy, and there was dialogue with the staff, and I think from my perspective it seemed that the policies that we have articulated here within the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan update actually have their basis with respect to floodplain management going back to the 1970s. And something that we had talking about was under the Carter administration, there was an Executive Order 11988, which basically specifies that federal investments need to take into account the wise use of floodplains. And within that executive order, it encouraged also the states to go through and adopt similar executive orders to incorporate the wise use of floodplains through the administration of the National Flood Insurance Program. Those were some of the actions that the Delta Plan, Delta Levy Investment Strategy recommendations also carried forth, so that there is this consistency that sits between the land use planning aspects of both plans. And then just to throw right back here a piece of legislation I think is foundational in the United States is the 1992 Delta Protection Act, where we actually established the primary secondary zones and the restrictions on intensification within the primary zone of the Delta. And that was very important and key pivotal policy that was incorporated into the land use and residual risk management policy areas of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. So I could go through obviously in each of the 8 policy areas and show where I see that there's some nexus and similarities, but I think the key message for you right now is that I feel very comfortable that these documents are very complementary of each other.
Good, appreciate that. Ken?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. First, as someone who's done quite a bit of infrastructure planning, I have to compliment you on a very ambitious, large plan and scope, and really having a process where it's clear you're in alignment with the stakeholders. I mean, that's not always the outcome of a large infrastructure planning process. So I compliments to the team that put this together. I think this discussion about multi-benefits kind of brings back sort of this typical integrated water management integrated regional water management. And I think at least in my part of the state, we had experience with these kind of projects and getting these multi-benefits and getting people in the room to talk about it. But the enticement was money. And I think that is the concern about IRWM is will it survive post bond measure money? Can have we really kind of institutionalized stuff? And I think, our experience in DLIS, there's not a lot of money there. And, when I look at, I'm on slide 6, and I look at the Sacramento Basin, are these annualized costs over 30 years, kind of like a net present value is, at the, 3.5 billion to 4.3 for urban areas? Is that kind of, you're taking is the relationship to the total capital costs, if you've annualized it and you've put in the operating costs and you ran it out for 30 years and brought it back?
Yes.
Is that what I'm looking at?
Yeah, so you're seeing the total 30-year cost there, and where we've incorporated and added to a first or capital cost, the maintenance of that, then we have gone annualized and then brought it back to a present value.
So that 12 or 13 billion to almost 16 billion, that's 400 to 500 million a year in sort of annualized capital and O&M. Just kind of saying
Right.
That's very, where we went through a prioritization process because there's limited funding. What is the idea of where this funding will come from? How much do the locals get? Is there some cross connection? Not in the water utility sense of it, but is there a cross connection with MS4 permits? And just my experience, a lot of what drove the flood control and stormwater, which is different in Southern California, is that the stormwater management piece of that. Or is this over and above? I mean, if you're looking at municipalities that are dealing with stormwater management and MS4 permits, and then you guys have to also invest on top of that. It just seems like, hey, the plan is great. The funding, our concern about achieving the co-equal goals, which means it really rests heavily on multi-benefit projects. How do we get that going? And I don't think, I'm not going to, expect you to have the answer. It's just, this seems, not having very much of a background, if any, in flood control, it just seems that, this funding challenge and the scale that we're talking about is pretty big. And
Right.
How do we achieve that?
Well, I first, you're right. The capital improvements represent about $17 billion over the 30 years. That's $5 billion spread out over 30 years for the total ongoing costs associated with basically the primary and secondary objectives of the flood plan. So this does not include everything that's happening in water management within the Central Valley. It just includes those activities that are tied to the flood system, which includes the operations and maintenance, as well as the ecosystem multi-benefits that we have been talking about here. These are rough order of cost magnitudes in there as well. There is a detailed investment strategy that goes through and describes, first, what the cost needs are. Second, it then talks about, if we were to be fully funded, how we would prioritize where we would want to send that funding to. And then it goes through a series of scenarios and talking about, if we don't achieve full funding, how would our priorities shift over eras or 10-year increments over the 30-year implementation of this plan update, as we would scale back on things. And then when you would go through and not have that funding available, obviously you're assuming risk and leaving benefits out on the table, so to speak. So that's all incorporated within there. I think I think that gets
Yeah, no,
most
I
of
mean,
what your point is.
Yeah, it's an impossible question to answer because we know what the constraints are. I think it gets to Senator Johnston's point earlier about the reclamation districts. Well, we don't have the money to do that. You're relying on some portion of local investments in these projects, and then the state brings something to the table, and, is the state funding whatever it is going to be like the IRWM objectives and try and use that money to get these multiple benefits?
Right, and just to further add to it, in general, I'm paying more for cell phone service and cable television than I am to keep myself safe as a private citizen. And I think most Californians would be shocked to realize how much the true costs of water are and what's typically happening, and we did see this within the operations maintenance report, is that we are accumulating debt over time through our deferred maintenance. We're not really funding water management activities at the level they should be at. The one silver lining I put on these numbers is those costs that you're seeing, that $21 billion, that's the local, state, federal cost share out there. Now, in the case of the routine operations and maintenance, we have an annual deficiency of $100 million per year. That's a hard number to swallow out there. But when we start getting into some of the emergency response planning out there, well, we've asked for additional funding for that. It's not nearly the same order of magnitude of gap that we're having in funding that. And again, I mentioned it earlier, but I think this year was a demonstration of the success of the local, state, and federal emergency response capabilities, both with the two storm events that we had that came through in January, as well as those in February. And it wasn't limited to just the Central Valley. The Bay Area, of course, had a massive evacuation as well, and this was done with minimal damages and life loss.
John, what's your perspective?
Well, I try to find the silver lining. I think the fact that there is not enough money to go around for all the things that individual agencies want to do ends up actually being an opportunity to start to think outside the box. Let me first say that I do think that the 2012 plan had a harder edge when it came to prioritization, and it basically said we're going to focus more on the urban areas and less on the rural areas, and that was hard for the rural areas to digest, but they've been digesting that, and I think that's still true of the 2017 plan. One place where I think that there's a lot of potential synergy and a lot of work to be done is the San Joaquin Valley. I think, I'll paraphrase Bill Edgar as saying, we don't really know what we're going to do to solve the problems in the San Joaquin Valley with regard to flood management. The projected 200-year events or are expected to increase by 60%. The historic flood of the 1997 will probably be doubled in a 200-year event, doubling the historic flood. We've got subsidence so that the levees are subsiding, and we also have groundwater depletion problems there, and a real driver to figure out how to come into balance. And then we have the San Joaquin River Restoration Program, which is really constrained by the flood control system right now. How are they going to get these restoration flows down the river through a network of regulatory flood control channels? And so the strategy of reinforcing the levee is it's not going to work there because the floodways are already just way too small for existing flows. So I think that this is going to create some new thinking of how can we completely reconfigure, even strategically abandon some of the levees. And this is not a pipe dream. This is actually already happening just downstream of the confluence of the San Joaquin and the Tuolumne. How can we actually start to decommission some of these levees, let the water overflow more, provide these multiple benefits? Is that the best way? Is that the most cost-effective way to get groundwater recharge? No, there's other ways to get where you can get better groundwater recharge. Is it the most cost-effective way to do some other things that we care about? Maybe not. But the value is it provides all of these different benefits. And so maybe it's not, if you only had money to put down on groundwater recharge, you might not do it by setting back a levee and restoring a floodplain. But if you have to work with other parties who are bringing money to the table. I think it forces a kind of synergy that maybe we haven't seen enough of. And I point us all to look at what can we do on this in the San Joaquin, integrating river restoration, groundwater recharge, and flood management over the next decade.
Thank you. If I wanted to, just going back to the question, I did actually have some of the answers in there where we were doing the math out of the calculus here. In our investment strategy, when we annualize that $5 billion for the ongoing costs, the range runs between $250 to $310 million per year, and that's covering four main activities. That's the routine operations and maintenance, that's the emergency response, that does include the routine reservoir operations and coordination, and here we were looking at the state-federal coordination, assuming that the local reservoir operators, as part of their practices, already had that covered. And then finally, we had the state flood planning and analysis, the functions that my team provides. The cost share on that, just anticipating what a question might be, and I think it's relevant, is about 3/4 of that, 74%, was envisioned as state costs, 12% for federal agencies, and then 14% from the local agencies. And as I had indicated earlier, we do, within the investment strategy, ramp that up over time. So we're not asking to go through and get that deficiency in funding immediately. Our current funding for all of those four buckets of activities is for the state, the federal, and local agencies are a little over $100 million per year. And what we've done is ramped it up to, within the first 10 years, around $160 to $170 million per year is where we need to go in the short term. And then when we get to the midterm, bring it up to about $250, and then having a little smaller step at the end of the 30-year planning horizon.
So is that general fund money, or is that all bond measure?
Well, it gets into a mix of funds, and that really is the $310 million question out there, where we've outlined general fund. We also were looking towards the drainage district, the fees assessed there to be one mechanism to address that at the state level, and then the river basin assessment could do some of that. There's potential for state flood insurance to pay for some of the planning and mapping activities, which are risk awareness and help us in the design of how we would operate the system and improve it over time. And then with the federal agencies, we did put in there sort of a generic request that the state would be supportive of future federal initiatives, something like the American Recovery and Investment Act from about a decade ago, for the federal government to meet their cost share. And then for the local agencies, it really relies on them to go through and come up with assessments on their beneficiaries. But in order to do that, both through the Central Flood Protection Plan and our statewide planning programs, we've been very proactive that there needs to be a re-examination of Proposition 218 so that these local agencies have the ability to go through and raise the revenue they need to meet the current requirements of them.
Yeah, and just one last comment about using state money to, leverage the other funding sources, but also incentivizing multiple benefits. I think seems to be the proven way to get this to happen and get people to kind of work together.
I'll just quickly add that I believe these costs include rather large permitting costs. There's a pretty big burden, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to try to bring those costs down. And our hope, and what we pledge to work on with the flood management agencies, is how to use this conservation strategy over time to create a much more efficient permitting process going forward that will lower these costs, hopefully.
Susan?
I really like the idea. I think, John, you put forth the idea of a pot of money for integration funding. And I'm remembering that Senate Bill 5 talked about the integration of the flood and water management systems. So I'm wondering, has anyone done sort of a funding crosswalk between what funds water supply and what funds flood risk reduction? And since we're aiming for multiple benefits, in addition to funding you're already getting for habitat restoration from Fish and Wildlife and others, is there a possibility of using water supply reliability funding getting back to Ken's idea of integrated water management, I imagine some of the integrated water management plans discuss flood risk reduction. So I was just wondering, when you're evaluating where can we find more money, did you take a look at any water supply benefits?
Not directly. Some of that was indirect when we were going through and working on the investment strategy, where we would look at what the operating expenses and revenue sources were for some of the local maintaining agencies, these reclamation districts. Some of these agencies actually do have multiple purposes, where they actually have a water supply function in addition to a reclamation function. Others don't. What we've tended to see, and this is a generalization, of course, is that those areas where they have multiple purposes out there, those local entities are able to better manage all of the challenges they have out there because they have some funding reliability out there. The poor flood control aspects of their work are often funded and sort of subsidized by, I should say, the overhead costs associated with those poor flood control costs are often subsidized or funded by some of the water supply costs out there. And this is where you see basically a irrigation function paralleled with the reclamation or the flood protection functions out there. Mm-hmm. But we haven't gone through and done a detailed study, and usually what we found anytime we dig into any of the local maintaining agencies' costs out there is it's very heterogeneous at that local scale out there, is that two different reclamation districts, depending on the system, the land use they have out there, their management team, and the landowner's willingness to actually pay what might be perceived as the fair cost, can have totally different operating costs and expenses. So it's, I think, an effort that we will continue to work on, and it is a very important area, but we're never going to have a smoking gun.
Anything else? Skip?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to thank the panel. It was a great presentation, very informative from my perspective. But I'd like to make a comment on the letter that the council sent to DWR. And it's in reference to the 2017 update. Under the flood management finance, it talks about reutilizing Sacramento San Joaquin Drainage District fee assessment. It also goes on to talk about a portfolio of sustainable finance mechanism based on the beneficiary pays principle. Mike, you brought up 218 and the beneficiaries issue. What we found at the Delta Protection Commission is that's not all as easy as it sounds, because you can't capture all the beneficiaries. And so what it leaves is the farming community looking at a pie that they thought was going to shrink because of additional payers now becoming larger as their responsibility. So I think we need to figure out how we're going to look at agriculture, and maybe it is a multi-benefit uses where farmers are becoming creative. They're looking at ways of providing habitat for a variety of different creatures. But I think in this discussion, we many times forget about those that own the land and are trying to figure out how they're going to make things work. And another assessment district on top of another assessment district tend to be a bit much. And we've heard here at this council that the margins aren't that great for some of the farmers in the Delta. So I think as we proceed down this and talk about raising the $21 billion, it's a great idea, but who's going to pay for it? So thank you.
Anyone else? Then Mike and John, thank you very much for coming. Congratulations on delivering an approved plan, and we stand ready to work with you to implement the respective provisions of the levy investment strategy and the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan in the Delta. Cindy, Leslie, thank you for joining us. Aaron, any closing comments?
I hadn't prepared any.
That's fine.
Okay.
We will now break for lunch. It is 12:30. We'll reconvene at, let's make it 1:20. We'll reconvene at 1:20.
That's precise.
178,000.
I know. That was a good number.
learning from my elders. Well, I thought an hour is too long, and 30 minutes isn't long enough. No, you're right on time. We are reconvening after a delicious lunch break. We left off on file item number 9. I failed to ask if there was any public comment. We had not received any requests for public comment, but I just wanted to make sure that there was no one remaining who wished to comment on that. Okay, so that concludes file item number 9. File item number 10, update on the Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan for the San Francisco Estuary. Jessica Law.
Thank you, Chair Fiorini. Good afternoon, council members. We're very happy to have Caitlin Sweeney, the Executive Director of the San Francisco Estuary Partnership, here with us today. She'll talk a little bit more about the CCMP, the Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan. And as a council, we've been involved in this process for a few years now. During the development of the 2016 CCMP, our staff members, Jessica Davenport and then also Reiner Hoenecke, have been involved in the development of it. If you remember at the April Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting, Tomas Torres, who's the Water Division Director for EPA, commented that he thought more coordination between the Bay and the Delta was a really great opportunity. And encouraged us to continue to participate in the CCMP. As a part of that plan, they have an implementation committee that has very similar, if not parallel, membership to our own DPIC committee. So I've joined the implementation committee as a member. Reiner is still also participating as an alternate. And then we've also encouraged some other Delta partners to participate. So Campbell Ingram from the Delta Conservancy is involved and a implementation committee member. And then also we've been doing a lot of coordination with other agencies that work in the Delta in order to sort of further the collaboration between both the lower and the upper estuary. So we've been working a lot with the State Water Resources Control Board and reviewing the actions that are in the CCMP that relate to the Delta. Caitlin will talk about this more, but one important thing to know about the CCMP is that it covers the San Francisco Estuary and includes the Delta and the Sassoon Marsh. So we are a part of this management plan. All right, with that, I'll introduce Caitlin Sweeney.
Thank you.
Welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, council members.
Is the microphone on to
Hello?
Jessica?
Yes.
There you go.
Get a little closer. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I want to start just a little bit of background on the Estuary Partnership because we're a bit of a complex entity that it's sometimes helpful to have a few slides to explain who we are and how we fit into this whole world. So we were actually established in 1988 under the Clean Water Act as a U.S. Environmental Protection Agency program to protect estuaries of national significance, of which San Francisco Estuary is one. So we are one of 28 national estuary programs across the country. And essentially,
So that was
I'm
during
sorry?
that was during President Reagan's administration, is that correct?
It was, yes.
Thank you.
Yes. So essentially, we leverage federal, state, and local resources to support projects and programs to restore the estuary system, and we work with a wide diversity of partners in doing so. So as Jessica Lau mentioned, this is our planning area, a map of our planning area. You can see that we encompass the entire bay and the legal delta and all of the watersheds that drain to the estuary. So we wouldn't be a national estuary program if we weren't a little bit complex in our structure, so I thought this might help you out a little bit. Again, we are under the Clean Water Act, so EPA is our federal partner, essentially our legislative home. we require program approval from EPA, and we do receive a small amount of base funding from EPA every year, assuming that it's available to us. And then all of the NEPs are structured a little bit differently in that they each have to have a local or a state partner to support the program. In our case, we have been a program of the Association of Bay Area Governments since the beginning almost. So they essentially have been our institutional, our administrative home. Most recently, the Association of Bay Area Governments has consolidated with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. So they've consolidated as one staff under one executive director of MTC. So ABAG still exists, MTC still exists, but there's one staff serving both to make it even more complex. So Estuary Partnership staff are MTC employees, but we still serve ABAG. But actually, it's been an interesting process for us, but has opened up a lot of opportunities to work with the planning staff of both ABAG and MTC to really integrate estuary considerations into land use planning and transportation planning. So it's a fascinating and opportunistic home for us to be in. So essentially, we are collaborative, we're non-regulatory, and like all national estuary programs, we are required by EPA to produce this mouthful of a plan called the Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan, or the CCMP. So every national estuary program must produce one of these, essentially a master plan for the estuary that they are responsible for. So we developed our first one in 1993, and at that point, it really was sort of the first master plan for the entire estuary. You know, since that time, we've had a lot of more integrated planning documents, but that was really the first effort to do so. And in 2007, we had an update to that. And then in 2016, we did a major overhaul of the plan. And as part of that overhaul, rebranded it as the Estuary Blueprint to try to avoid people having to say Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan over and over again. But a lot of our partners have been working with us for a long time and still associate CCMP, so I use Blueprint and CCMP interchangeably. These are the key objectives we had for our 2016 revision. I just wanted to point out a couple of them. Like the work that you've been doing with the Delta Plan, we're really all focused on not necessarily restoring to a past, but learning how to adapt to a state of change, so look towards a changing future. Our first Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan was very comprehensive. It had a large suite of actions, which was appropriate for the time. Again, as the first master planning document, we really threw everything in because it was an opportunity to engage all of these partners. But with this revision, we really wanted to be much more strategic and focused and prioritized. One of the reasons we are able to be strategic and focused and prioritized is because there has been so much great work done since the first 1993 CCMP. A lot of great documents have been produced. So we really focused our efforts in supporting those other efforts, integrating some key priorities from those other plans and documents, policy documents, into this version of the CCMP. And one of those specific elements was really focusing on increasing our integration between the Bay and the Delta. So we've always had the entire Bay and Delta, the entire estuary as our planning area, but have, honestly spent the majority of our early time much more focused on the Bay. So we've been making slow but steady progress on that integration front, starting with our culminating in some aspects with the 2015 State of the Estuary Report, which you may be familiar with, really the most comprehensive state of the health of the entire estuary that we have. And the 2015 one was the first time that we were able to call it the State of the Estuary Report rather than just the State of the Bay Report. And we worked very hard with our Delta partners to incorporate Delta indicators of health into that report. So this estuary blueprint gives us an opportunity to further that integration with our partners with the Delta region. And then, of course, lastly, as we all need to do with all of our planning efforts, it's critical that we're able to not only track our progress, but accurately report out on progress. So let me talk a little bit about the blueprint itself now. So again, this was about 3 years in planning to get to this point, engaging about 100 partners in the effort. And the blueprint seeks the answers to these two critical questions. One, sort of this long-term vision, where do we want to be in 2050? What's our 35-year vision? And then critically, what can we do over the next 5 years to help get us there? What is our 5-year action plan? And I always like to think about sitting on that bench there, staring at the water and wondering, what is it likely to look like there in 2050? Will I be up to my neck in water? Or, what sort of invasive species will I be looking at? And using that as a framework for thinking about what we want our estuary to look like in the future. I wrote down a quick quote from the Perspectives of the State of the Bay Delta Science that I thought was really accurate, the same perspective that we brought to this planning effort, which was, we have to envision desirable possible futures and work to steer change in that direction. So we're very aligned in that desire. So the blueprint is, the framework of the blueprint is on these 4 overarching goals. These are our aspirational long-term goals. Excuse me. And they are to sustain and improve our habitats and living resources, to bolster the resilience of the estuary to climate change, to improve water quality and increase the quantity of fresh water available to the estuary, and to champion the estuary. Under the goals, we have a suite of objectives, and then we have our actions, which again is really the meat of the document, our work plan, so to speak. This is our set of strategies that are achievable within the next 5 years. Not that they are all easy, but they are feasible given the right amount of resources, the right amount of partnering, the right amount of focus and dedication. So there are 32 actions in the document, each with a subset of tasks. Each of those actions help advance one or more objectives and goals. So we tried to get away from really siloing actions to objectives to goals, and in recognition that we all are taking a much more integrated approach to our management responses to the ecosystem needs. So we have a nice chart in there that just makes those connections between actions and various objectives and goals. This is impossible to read except for those of you who might have the paper copy, but I just want to point out this is what we call the anatomy of an action. Every action in the document is structured this way, and I wanted to point out a few key elements of this. So every action has a description, of course, and then there are specific tasks for every action. And then each of those tasks has an associated milestone. So by X date, Y will happen. There's some background information, and then importantly, there are listed owners, and these are owners at the task level. So the owner might be SFEP, might be the partnership, or it might be one of our other hundreds of partners. And those are entities that have stepped up and said, I want to take responsibility for advancing this action. This action is critical to me, or I'm already engaged in it, or I have a real interest in advancing it. I want to be a steward of this action. Put me down. And then in addition to the owners, we have a list of collaborating partners. And the collaborating partners are more at the action level, and they're a list of key entities in addition to the owners that have a vested interest in this action. So they might be stewards of those actions, or contributing critical scientific expertise to advancing the action, or implementers. So this is where I summarize all 32 actions and 4 to 6 tasks under each action in 9 concise bullets. So it's a whirlwind tour of the estuary blueprint. Thanks to a professional editor who helped me winnow down to be able to talk about this in 9 bullets. But it gives you a taste, a flavor of the variety of topics that we cover in the blueprint. So we have actions that are focused on our desire to take a watershed approach to our planning and our protection of our resources, and really understanding those connections between upstream and downstream, and between streams and rivers and the estuary. We have actions that are focused on protecting and restoring very specific habitat types, really building on our past investment, our significant past investment in restoring habitats and advancing that further. There are actions that are much more focused on protecting native species and native habitats, on advancing our ability to manage our system at a system level, so really thinking about those connections between habitats, the movement of critters, the movement of sediments. and also to support natural solutions to protecting our shores, so advancing natural infrastructure and resilience adaptation strategies in our shorelines. We have actions specifically focused on planning for long-term droughts or responding to our sort of flood or drought situation we seem to be in and are likely to be in, continuing. So pushing for water conservation, recycling, regional planning, expanding our use of recycled water, that sort of thing. And then also focusing on some of our key water quality issues, continuing our efforts to reduce mercury and PCBs, other water quality concerns, and spearheading new initiatives as new challenges emerge, such as emerging contaminants or ocean acidification. And then, of course, we want to push ourselves. This is a 5-year action plan, but we still want to push ourselves to tackle some of those more thorny issues that we might not necessarily reach any conclusion on, but we can have these interim steps that advance our knowledge and understanding. For example, on carbon sequestration, this whole issue of sediments, how do we beneficially reuse sediment that we are dredging or even from construction projects to help build up habitats to keep pace with sea level rise, for example. And how do we make these resilient land use planning practices that we're working on more pervasive? How do we better integrate green stormwater management with our transportation projects, for example? And then, of course, we want to continue to keep the public in the loop about how we're spending their tax dollars, why they should care, and how they can get engaged in this. For us, this is really focused on SFEP's efforts, so it's focused on our estuary news, our own social media strategy, our website, continuing to revise the State of the Estuary report in the CCMP, and also our biennial State of the Estuary Conference. So this is my official plug for the State of the Estuary Conference, October 10th and 11th at the lovely Oakland Scottish Rite Center on the shores of beautiful Lake Merritt in Oakland. But we have a lot of great sessions planned, including many that are focused on Delta. We have a concurrent session on Delta restoration planning. Jessica will be presenting at that. We have a water quality session that's focused specifically on the Suisun Bay and Marsh. And we have one on the Bay Delta Science Enterprise. So online registration ends October 2nd. So I wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about the Stewardship Council and the blueprint. So I mentioned that we have owners and collaborating partners. The council is listed as an owner of one of these tasks. This task is under the action of integrating natural resource protection into hazard mitigation response and recovery planning, and the task itself is to implement or to develop the Delta Levees investment strategy, which of course you did. So we get to check that off as a success. Thank you very much. You've fed into our pie chart of successes. But this is one example of how we really worked with our Delta partners to pull what was critical from the work that you're doing and amplify it in the estuary blueprint to help support it and help support the work you're doing and to help celebrate your successes. And then the council is also listed as a collaborating partner in 6 more actions. These are focused on watershed-based approach to aquatic resource protection, to developing a wetland and stream monitoring program, managing invasive species, addressing that carbon sequestration through wetland restoration, restoring those watershed connections to improve habitat and flood protection, and advancing public access and recreation in a way that protects wildlife in the estuary. So I talked a little bit about the importance of tracking progress. We've been working with your staff quite a bit on aligning our measures of performance with the performance measures of the Delta Plan, and we really look forward to, we were talking about just at lunch today, we really look forward to more opportunities to continuing to integrate those performance measures. So similarly, for the blueprint, we are tracking our programmatic outputs, so whether or not we've met those milestones by the date we said we were going to meet them, a fairly easy way to track progress. And then we also, of course, want to track our outcomes, our environmental outcomes. In our case, this is really linked to the State of the Estuary report and those indicators of health that are in that report. So we have linked the actions in the estuary blueprint where we can to the specific indicators in the State of the Estuary report. So the idea being that we can assess the status and trends of those indicators, those health indicators, and we can assess our programmatic output. Were we able to accomplish these management actions that we set forth? And by looking at those together, the relationship, can't be, it's not a scientific causal relationship, but we can make some very informed, educated decisions about where to take our management actions next based on the status and trends of these indicators, so that we really develop this adaptive management framework where we're constantly assessing the health and responding accordingly and have that loop built in. So we do have a website which has the document itself as well as the executive summary, but it also has a lot of additional information that the document does not contain. For example, it has a funding analysis. We specifically didn't include anything about cost in the document itself because that quickly gets out of date. As soon as you put a number to something, construction costs go up, whatever it may be. So we wanted something that was more of a living document that we could continue to update. So that we did spend the time at the task level, each milestone, working with our partners to develop as accurate assessment as we could of the cost of each action, and tallied them all up. And spoiler alert, it's probably about $2 to $3 billion to implement this plan. But the good news is we have probably over $1 billion at this point already committed with projects that are in the works, and we have opportunities to seek new funding. There's new funding opportunities, least in the Bay, for example, for Measure AA. There are certainly propositions and bond funding that we can seek. We as a partnership and all of our partners, as you know, yourselves included, are very adept at leveraging our resources for other resources. So particularly in the time when we're all looking at likely federal cuts, this becomes even more important that we're really leveraging our local and state resources to complete the projects. So in addition to the funding analysis, we have an interactive progress tracker. So this is a live tool whereby you can go into an individual action, click on it, and it'll show you at the task level the % complete of each task. So it's updated on a quarterly basis by staff working with our partners. Where are you with this? How are we doing? Going in and changing the numbers, and you can keep pretty accurate assessment of where we are with progress. We also send out a quarterly newsletter mostly to the owners and collaborating partners that are listed in the document, but to anybody else who's interested, that captures that information more in pie chart form. So on a 2-year basis, here's how many actions are completed, in progress, not yet started, and we have that running assessment as well. And then lastly, on our website, we have success stories. So this is a planning document. As beautiful as it is, and it is beautiful, it's still a planning document. It's very hard to make planning documents exciting and interesting to a wide variety of people. So the website really gives us an opportunity to talk about our success stories in an interesting and narrative form and celebrate our successes that we and our partners have undertaken. So we have a whole series of success stories currently on the website. This is an example of one that's currently up there. This celebrates the Innovation Award to the Delta Conservancy and its partners for the development of the carbon offset methodology. So we have a nice story that goes with this to celebrate that success. And that was actually an action that is in the blueprint to develop this. So I'll leave you with a couple of quotes from our implementation committee members. Amy Hutzel is the chair of our implementation committee, and she's the deputy executive officer of the State Coastal Conservancy. And she says, the CCMP catalyzes the work of others, setting goals, defining actions, and aiding in efforts to collaborate among multiple agencies and organizations. And I really like that quote, particularly the word catalyzes. I think that's an accurate assessment of what we tried to do with the CCMP and working with our partners and zeroing in on those priorities. Similarly, John Andrew, another implementation committee member, says, the CCMP connects and integrates other regional planning efforts, building upon and leveraging existing plans. It also serves to prioritize a seemingly endless to-do list for the estuary, which I also love that quote, because it does. I mean, one benefit of limiting ourselves to a 5-year action plan is we were all forced to really prioritize this endless to-do list that we have for the estuary. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Caitlin, thank you. Questions of Caitlin? Patrick?
I just wanted to compliment you. This is really wonderfully understandable as well as comprehensive. And I kept wondering where you found out, well, how we doing, but the answer you just gave, right?
Right.
It's online and it's
Online.
continuous.
Yes.
Thank you.
Others?
I agree with my colleague. It was easy reading. For me, that's tough sometimes. But maybe I'm showing my ignorance here, but on page 18, or slide 18, you talk about solving thorny challenges, how to trap carbon in wetlands, and that theme kind of goes through a number of other. Could you share with me what you're looking at, what you're trying to achieve?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. The action on that was focused on a couple, again, this is what we can do in 5 years. So a lot of it was really focused on advancing the science. What do we know about the opportunity to trap carbon in wetlands? What can we learn about the design of wetland restoration projects to trap carbon? So my CCMP is back there, but there are a couple specific actions to advance the state of that knowledge and also to develop that carbon offset methodology that the Conservancy did. And I believe there might be specific tasks about that are specific to the Delta and creating wetlands with that in mind. Grab my CCMP.
Well, you're getting that, I'll acknowledge that Campbell Ingram is here to take a bow for the award that they received.
So right, we have the convert 3,000 acres to wetlands in the Suisun and Delta region as one of our milestones to advance that.
Other questions, comments? Ken?
It is a very beautiful plan. Congratulate you on it. And just a couple of questions. Sorry. Just a couple of questions on the actions. And Action 27, you've got sort of implement the TMDLs, and you've got an incredible planning area. So you did say it includes the legal delta, and so I think these are really admirable goals, but that's a pretty involved process in developing TMDLs, and how are you, I mean, that's up to the regional board, wherever you are, how are you dealing with the local entities in the Delta that would be affected by the TMDL? Are they part of this process, or are you working on, independently with the regional board advocating for TMDLs, and you're just sort of going to have it out at the local regional board over what that TMDL is, which I think is a bad idea. So that's just sort of my experience, that is kind of like, okay, what are you doing? How are you working together to arrive at something that, works for everybody, achieves the goal, but, recognizing that somebody's ox gets gored usually in these processes?
Yeah, that's a great question. This action is one that we partnered very closely with the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board, and I have to admit less so with the Central Valley, though we're partnering with them a lot more now. So most of the tasks under this action are focused on TMDLs that the board already has in place and just assisting them.
Getting them to enforce it.
Right, assisting them in implementing it by helping coordinate local jurisdictions or provide information or resources where we can.
Yeah, it just, encouraging you to reach out to the stakeholders just because this is usually a controversial process. My other question is, really, and maybe it's Action 19 on developing long-term drought plans. One of your slides, I think one of the 4 goals was to increase fresh water into the estuary. And, you know, I think maybe this gets to how does your plan and the Delta plan coexist or work in tandem. And it's very clear on one of the co-equal goals, maybe a little less clear on the other co-equal goals because, you know, we're trying to avoid conflict. So that seems kind of general. The goal is to get more fresh water in there, and then water supply as well. We need to have these 5-year drought plans, and we encourage recycling. I noticed you didn't say desalination, so I mean, I understood that. But how do you, I mean, we're an advocate for water supply reliability and ecosystem restoration. You know, what is your goal there? What is it, more fresh water at whatever the cost on water supply or?
As an estuary program, our goal is always focused on the health of the estuary. So that's where all of our actions emanate from. So even our actions on water recycling and water reuse are really focused on the subsequential health of the estuary. That being said, we understand and fully acknowledge and embrace the fact that the health of the estuary is intermingled with the health of our surrounding communities, including the economic health of our communities. So I say more and more the estuary program as a program itself is pushing those boundaries a little bit and really integrating what we mean by health of the estuary. But for this document, yes, they're really focused on estuarine health.
Yeah, and I understand, I mean, that's your mission.
Right.
And just kind of pointing out that there may not be total alignment between your plan and the Delta plan.
Correct.
So thank you.
Caitlin, I'd call attention for my colleagues to the Estuary News article by John Hart that does an excellent job of describing the history of planned developments, and then at the end of that contrasts the 2 plans. And his observation is that the level of communication and cooperation has increased significantly. For our purposes, I like his summary of for the upper estuary. He says the challenge is a bit different. He identifies in the bay that there's pretty much uniform agreement on what needs to be done, but the power is so diffused and the funding is so diffused, it takes a long time to coalesce around much. For us, he says, the challenge is a bit different. Here the obstacle is deep disagreement about fundamentals. The allocation of available river flows, the shape of future water supply plumbing, even the physical future of the delta itself. Stasis seems likely to persist until some painful and deeply controversial decisions are made. How does that make you feel? We're about to embark on an amendment to our ecosystem chapter. And I expect that you folks will be working closely with our staff to help do what we didn't have much of an eye on when we developed the Delta Plan and adopted it in 2013, and that is find linkages between the Delta and the Bay. So this is great work. In fact, I made a few notes about things that we could take away from your process and maybe apply to the Delta Plan implementation process.
Thank you. I would echo the same. We steal liberally from the great work that you do.
That's a sign of a great partnership. Any other comments or questions? Caitlin, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Great work. Thank you for coming today.
My pleasure.
Pat, any requests for comment on this file item? All right. Do we have I think we have one request for public comment under file item number 11. Mark? Mark Pruner, Mayor of Clarksburg.
Just a lowly resident of the Delta. Thank you very much. I just want to ask
Understanding there's no action item that can be taken in public comment, but just to note that out on the table outside the door, hope you all picked up one of these. Yesterday, California Department of Fish and Wildlife released its long-awaited draft of the Delta Conservation Framework. It's a proposed framework of analysis for all matters environmental that is intended to last out until 2050. I believe, having seen some earlier renditions of the document, that it will greatly impact your work, the Delta Plan, and of course all things Delta. Fundamentally, though, I ask the council to take note that what the department is trying to do with this document, and I have to laud them for this as a resident of the Delta, they are trying to fully integrate the provisions of Water Code Section 85054, which says the water conveyance and ecosystem restoration are the key goals, but those two goals may not be accomplished without Delta values being honored and considered. My words, not the statute's words. That fundamental construct, which was put together at the inception of the 2009 legislation and debated hotly, I think is now, through the department's work, at least in one governmental agency's efforts, those two, what apparently look to be competing and opposite concerns and directions, are trying to be put together. My perception is that the department's work represents a fundamental shift of thinking in how Delta issues are approached. So my request is twofold. A, there's currently a 45-day clock established by the department starting yesterday for comments to be made on this framework, which will last a long time. That's a very short period of time. And I don't think that the council staff or the council itself will find that that time frame is sufficient for you to look at a voluminous document, its technical appendices, and come out with your comments, recommendations, and thoughts and input, nor will your staff be able to accomplish that meaningfully. Great staff. But meaningfully in such a short period of time. So my request is that the council ask for more time. Frankly, it's more powerful coming from you than it is from a resident. Second, I would ask that the council in a future agenda consider the report, what it means, take further input, and do your best to integrate that into the ongoing effort to revise the Delta Plan, which I know you're engaged in and will be commencing in earnest next year. Thank you very much.
So Mark, we've anticipated the report. We've been working with Fish and Wildlife. We've received updates. I think the staff is well along on reviewing the document already, and we do intend to use that as guidance material for the upcoming ecosystem amendment. So I acknowledge your comments and just want to reassure you that both are in play already.
Good. I look forward to seeing what you come up with.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Anyone else wish to address the council on any matter? Then next item.
Mr. Chair, could I make a comment? You know, seeing Mark at the podium reminds me of something that I've always thought the process should be, is public comment at the end of a meeting is a bit awkward for the public, because Mark's been sitting around most of the day waiting to make those comments. And my 9 meetings that I've had, or 10 or 12, how many it's been, I haven't seen a lot of rush to the podium. So would the council consider moving public comment to the front to allow the public to come in, have their say? Because if they're going to comment on an item, they have to wait for the item, obviously. But this is very brief, to the point, and they're out of here. So if the council would consider that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Then the next item is, thank you for coming, meeting adjourned.